Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. Ricky's reality. Years ago, during my college days, I was having lunch with a group of friends in a beautiful outdoor plaza on campus. It was a vibrant, bustling space, filled with students enjoying the sunshine and each other's company. As I scanned the area, I noticed a guy I vaguely recognized from one of my classes, sitting alone at a table, seemingly isolated. His name was Ricky, and he always seemed a bit shy, a bit withdrawn. He looked particularly lonely that day, and a pang of empathy prompted me to act. "Hey, you're Ricky, right? From sociology class?" I called out, gesturing towards our table. "Why don't you come join us?" He hesitated for a moment, then, with a shy smile, accepted my invitation. He joined our group, and while he remained relatively quiet, everyone made an effort to include him in the conversation, introducing themselves and making small talk. It was a brief, pleasant interaction, a simple act of kindness, and that, I thought, was that. It was the last interaction I consciously remembered having with Ricky, or because of Ricky until several months later, when a series of events unfolded that would leave me deeply shaken and confused. It was during one of my work shifts. I was on break when I was unexpectedly cornered by a group of 4 guys I barely knew. They were confrontational, their faces etched with anger. "You're being a real jerk to Ricky," one of them said, his voice accusatory, "and it has to stop." I was utterly bewildered. I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. "Who's Ricky?" I asked, my confusion genuine. "Are you sure you have the right person? I don't know what you're talking about." They didn't believe me. Their disbelief was palpable, their anger unwavering. "He said you're leading Ricky on, then blowing him off, then leading him on again with promises. And he's at campus health right now, being evaluated, and it's all your fault for messing with his head." I was terrified, completely overwhelmed by the intensity of their accusation and the utter lack of context. Thankfully, at that moment, my coworker, an older woman named Sarah, came outside and intervened. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice firm and authoritative. One of the guys turned to her and said, "Your friend here has been messing with our friend Ricky, and we're here to make sure that she stops." I seized the opportunity to clarify, my voice trembling slightly. "Ricky from my sociology class last semester? I hardly know the guy. We're talking about the same person, right?" The presence of my coworker seemed to deflate the guy's bravado somewhat. Sarah, clearly angry, threatened to call security and have them all arrested for harassing me. She vouched for my character, stating that she knew me and that I was a good person who would never intentionally hurt someone. She told them they had the wrong person and needed to leave. But I needed to understand. I needed to know what was going on. "Wait," I said, my voice regaining some strength. "I want to know what's happening. I know Ricky. I spoke to him once in my life. What is going on?" The story that unfolded was both bizarre and deeply disturbing. Apparently, that single act of kindness, inviting Ricky to join my friends and me for lunch, had somehow led him to believe that I was in love with him. He'd constructed an elaborate, delusional relationship in his mind, a fantasy that he believed with unwavering conviction. He'd shared this fantasy with his friends, recounting detailed stories of our supposed relationship. And his friends, astonishingly, had never questioned it. They'd believed his lies, never once stopping to consider why Ricky and I were never seen together, why there was no evidence whatsoever of this supposed romance. I wondered, for a moment, if Ricky was intentionally lying, perhaps to create the illusion of having a girlfriend. Maybe, when I didn't reciprocate his imagined affections, he'd simply claimed I dumped him, a convenient cover story. But as I learned more about certain psychological disorders, I came to believe that Ricky genuinely believed his own fantasies. He was living in a delusional world, and when he had a breakdown, apparently triggered by my supposed cruelty, his friends, fueled by his fabricated narrative, had sought me out to exact their misguided revenge. They knew where I worked. That was the most terrifying part. They knew my routine, my location, and I had absolutely no idea any of this was going on. It was a chilling realization, a stark reminder of how easily our lives can be infiltrated by the unseen, the unknown. Did any of those boys ever apologize to me? No. In fact, at least one of them remained convinced that I was lying, even after it became clear that Ricky was mentally unwell, that something was profoundly wrong. At the time, the experience was frightening enough. But years later, it's even more terrifying. The realization that all of this could unfold without my knowledge. The ease with which people can believe utter fabrications, and their unwillingness to admit their mistakes. It's a chilling testament to the fragility of reality and the power of delusion. I'm eternally grateful to my coworker, Sarah, for her intervention, for standing up for me in the face of such unfounded aggression. It was one of the most frightening and confusing moments of my life, and I was constantly on edge afterward whenever I saw Ricky or one of his friends around campus. I have no idea where Ricky and his friends are today, but I never ever should have invited him over to that lunch. It was a simple act of kindness that spiraled into a terrifying, surreal ordeal, a stark reminder that even the smallest gestures can have unforeseen and potentially dangerous consequences. The altar and the app. This happened about a year ago. I was using Grindr, a social networking app primarily used by gay men, often for casual encounters, but also for dating and forming relationships. I was browsing profiles, looking for someone interesting, someone I might connect with either for a fun night or, ideally, something more substantial. I received a new message from a guy I'll call Brandon. I checked out his profile pictures, read his bio, and found myself intrigued. He seemed attractive, intelligent, and engaging. We started messaging back and forth, and he proved to be a surprisingly good conversationalist, something of a rarity on the app. He was charismatic, witty, and seemed genuinely kind. After a few days of consistent communication, we exchanged numbers. He continued to impress me with his thoughtful messages and easygoing personality. I decided I wanted to meet him in person to see if the chemistry we had online translated to the real world. So, I asked him out on a date. I suggested we grab lattes at my favorite local coffee shop, a casual, public setting that felt safe and comfortable for a first meeting. He enthusiastically agreed, and we set a date. The plan was for me to drive to his place and pick him up. It was around 6 p.m., and I sent him a text message to let him know I was leaving my house. He responded with a playful, "I can't wait to meet you." I smiled, feeling a flutter of anticipation, pleased with his apparent enthusiasm. Then, in the middle of my drive, I received a phone call from him. I answered, expecting a minor change of plans, perhaps a different coffee shop or a slight delay. "Hey, Brandon, what's up?" I said. "Hey," he replied, his voice sounding different than I'd imagined. "Quick change of plans. I'm feeling tired, and I'd rather not go out. Would you be okay with staying at my place? We can watch some shows and order some takeout." My initial reaction was disappointment. I mean, that's not really what I had in mind, I admitted. I'd like to go out and do things on the first date. His response was jarring. "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill," he said, his tone dismissive and slightly aggressive. "Just come over. I won't show you a bad time." As he spoke, a wave of unease washed over me. Something about his voice, his inflection, felt off. Based on our text messages, I'd envisioned him as lighthearted and playful, but over the phone, he sounded rushed, almost frantic. Despite my growing apprehension, I decided to accept his offer. Maybe he was just tired, stressed from work. I didn't want to overreact, to jump to conclusions. I pulled into his driveway, and he greeted me at the door. He looked like his pictures, undeniably handsome. He was wearing stylish glasses, and his dark, straight hair contrasted sharply with his pale skin. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by one of his roommates, who was engrossed in a video game at Dark Souls, I believe, in the living room. Wanting to be polite, I approached the roommate and introduced myself, hoping to make a good impression on Brandon's friends. While I was chatting with his roommate, Brandon called my name, beckoning me to follow him into his bedroom. I politely excused myself and followed him. And that's when I saw it. A scene that looked like it had been ripped straight from a horror movie. Only this was real, unfolding before my very eyes. Candles were lit all around the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And scattered throughout the room were altars. Not just one or two, but several, each adorned with an unsettling array of objects. Ancient-looking figurines, animal bones, jars filled with unidentifiable liquids, and, most disturbingly, a dagger placed next to a cat's skull. I don't remember all the details of each altar, but a few images remain seared into my memory. One altar was on the floor, featuring a glass container filled with a yellowish liquid, surrounded by animal skulls. Another was on a shelf next to his bed, with candles encircling a doll with its eyes sewn shut and its hands missing. It was a bizarre, unsettling collection, a macabre display that sent shivers down my spine. A part of me screamed to get out, to run as fast as I could. But another part of me, perhaps foolishly, tried to rationalize the situation. I didn't know much about occult practices or alternative religions. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, to assume that Brandon had malicious intentions. Plus, I admit, I can be a bit reactive at times, so I decided to stay, to see where this bizarre evening would lead. As I stood there, trying to process the scene before me, I decided to break the tension by asking about the altars. My curiosity piqued despite my growing apprehension. "What are these for?" I asked, gesturing towards the unsettling displays. He replied, his voice evasive, "I'll tell you about them later." It was a strange response, but again, I brushed it off, attributing it to eccentricity. I can be a bit weird myself, so I try to be understanding of others' quirks. Then, I pointed to one of the altars, the one with the doll, and asked, "What's this one about?" His reaction was immediate and jarring. He frowned, his face contorting into a scowl. "Don't touch that," he snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. The sudden shift in his demeanor startled me. I was at least 4 feet away from the altar, nowhere near touching it. Yet, he'd yelled at me as if I were a child misbehaving in church. I was confused, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I apologized, unsure of what I'd done wrong. And then, just as quickly as his anger had flared, it vanished. His scowl melted into a smile, a genuinely warm, inviting smile. He kindly invited me to sit with him on the couch and watch a show. It was unnerving, this rapid shift in personality. It was as if he were 2 different people, seamlessly switching between them. I was unsure how to process it, so I simply sat down, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. We started talking, discussing our lives, our interests. He was sweet, soft-spoken, much like he'd been over text messages. It felt like a genuine first date, and my nerves began to subside, if only slightly. I started to think that maybe I had been overreacting, that he was just a bit eccentric. Then he turned on his TV. I was still on edge, still wary of his unpredictable behavior. So, I made a suggestion, hoping to introduce a buffer, a sense of normalcy. "Hey, why don't we invite your roommate in to hang out with us?" I asked. His roommate seemed like a perfectly average guy when I'd met him, and I thought his presence might ease the tension, provide a more comfortable atmosphere. But Brandon immediately shot down my suggestion, his personality shifting again. From easygoing to stressed and angry, he started cursing out his roommate, making it abundantly clear that he despised him. The sudden switch was jarring, unsettling. I started to panic again. Then, just as abruptly, he changed the subject, turning his attention back to me. He complimented my appearance, saying he found me very attractive. As he spoke, his fingers began to graze my thighs, a touch that felt intrusive and unwelcome. I needed a moment to collect myself, to process this escalating series of bizarre events. So, I excused myself, saying I needed to get some water. As I stood up, he immediately slapped my butt, a gesture that was both disrespectful and unwanted. "Don't take too long," he said, his tone playful but with an underlying edge. I walked out of the room, closing the door behind me, my heart pounding. I headed for the kitchen, hoping to catch his roommate on the way and perhaps glean some information about Brandon's behavior. But the roommate was asleep on the living room couch, oblivious to the unfolding drama. I went to the cabinets searching for a glass. My mind raced. I considered simply walking out, driving away, escaping this increasingly unsettling situation. But paranoia started to creep in. He had all those altars, those strange objects. He hadn't explained their purpose. I'd seen enough horror movies about the occult to know that messing with such things could have unpredictable consequences. Who was to say this guy wasn't capable of putting some kind of voodoo curse on me? Yes, it was a dramatic thought, perhaps even irrational. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of being in the presence of something unnatural. So I grabbed a glass of water and cautiously returned to his room. When I walked back in, I saw him sitting on the couch, his legs crossed, his eyes closed. As I approached, I noticed his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear any sound. It was incredibly unnerving. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Strange. I called his name a second time, and he finally opened his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and turned his attention back to the television, without acknowledging his bizarre behavior. What had he been doing? Chanting? Praying? Something else entirely? I was increasingly worried, but I tried to maintain my composure. I didn't want to do anything to upset him, to trigger another outburst. I sat down next to him on the couch and we resumed talking. He was completely normal again, unnervingly so. It was as if the previous incidents had never happened. It felt like I was interacting with a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except Brandon could switch between his personalities seamlessly, without warning. I knew I needed to leave, but I was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't confront him, he might lash out. But I also couldn't stay, he was clearly unstable. I tried to devise a plan, some way to escape without provoking him. Then he got up to grab his phone, and in a moment of reckless impulsivity, I decided to try something. I decided to dish out some of the same treatment he'd given me. I reached out and grabbed his butt, a cheeky, playful gesture. Maybe it would ease the tension, I thought. Maybe he'd appreciate it, and it would make him less aggressive. His reaction was immediate and violent. He spun around, swatting my hand away, and lunged at me. His hands were curled into fists, and he swung one towards my face. His fist stopped inches from my cheek, frozen mid-punch. In that moment, I saw his eyes. They were wide open, his expression cold, emotionless. He was right in my face, his presence menacing, overwhelming. My heart was beating so fast, I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack. Then he unfurled his fist, placed his hands on either side of my face, and started to squeeze. "You're just so cute," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone, as if he were talking to a dog. He pulled me in and forced a kiss on me. It was a kiss I absolutely did not want, but I was paralyzed, unable to resist. I felt disgusted, violated, kissing someone who had just threatened me with physical violence. He slowly pulled away, gave me another unsettlingly sweet smile, and sat back down, resuming his position in front of the television, as if nothing had happened. That was it. I was done. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, unpredictable. His room was a shrine to some unknown, unsettling practice. He was clearly associated with the occult and, frankly, he was terrifying me. I decided I'd rather deal with the potential consequences of his voodoo altars later than remain in his presence any longer. I snapped myself out of my anxiety-induced trance, stood up, and announced that I was starting to feel sick and needed to go home. He got angry, trying to convince me to stay the night, his voice taking on that sharp, aggressive edge again. But I stood my ground, mustering all my courage, and insisted that it was time for me to leave. He begrudgingly relented, but it was clear that my decision had upset him. I didn't care. I said my goodbyes, feigning a promise to text him later, and practically ran out of the house. I got in my car and drove home, shaking, sweating, my mind racing. I felt a wave of relief at escaping that unsettling situation, but also a lingering fear that he might try to retaliate in some way. The uncertainty of it all was what truly disturbed me. Thankfully, no actual harm came to me. I blocked Brandon's number, as well as his Grindr profile. I haven't heard from him since, but even now, I still harbor a fear that he might try to find me, to seek some kind of twisted revenge. It's a lingering anxiety, a constant reminder of that bizarre, terrifying night and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The static on Channel 0. The static began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible hiss that overlaid the crisp, clear audio of the late-night talk radio show Detective Miles Corbin, was listening to. It was 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was driving my unmarked Ford Taurus down a deserted stretch of Route 60, heading back to the precinct after a fruitless stakeout. I'd been a detective with the Phoenix PD for 12 years, long enough to have seen my share of strange things, unsettling things, things that defied easy explanation. But this was different. The static grew louder, evolving into a crackling, white noise roar that drowned out the radio host's voice. I reached for the dial, trying to find another station, but every frequency was the same, pure, unadulterated static. Then I heard it, my name, whispered through the static, a soft, almost intimate voice that seemed to come from inside my own head. Miles. My hand froze on the dial. My blood ran cold. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there, just the empty back seat, bathed in the faint, red glow of the dashboard lights. The road ahead was empty, a ribbon of black asphalt stretching endlessly into the Arizona desert. The only illumination came from my headlights, cutting twin swaths through the darkness, and the pale, ethereal light of the moon. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The last sign of civilization had been a dusty, dilapidated gas station, miles back. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Miles, listen. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, the car swerving slightly before coming to a stop on the shoulder of the road. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I grabbed my phone, intending to call dispatch, to report. What? A strange voice on the radio? They'd laughed me off the line. The phone screen displayed a single bar of signal. I tried to dial, but the call wouldn't go through. Then, I noticed something else. A notification, a text message. From my own number. My hands trembled as I opened the message. It was short, cryptic, and terrifying. Don't stop. I stared at the message, my mind reeling. How could I have sent a text message to myself? And what did it mean? Don't stop. Don't stop. What? Driving? Breathing? Living? The static on the radio intensified, a deafening roar that filled the car. Through the white noise, I could hear the whisper again, more urgent now, laced with a hint of panic. Miles, behind you. My blood turned to ice. I slowly turned my head, peering into the rearview mirror, expecting to see some monstrous figure, some terrifying apparition. First, I saw nothing, just the empty road, stretching behind me into the darkness. Then, in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. They were faint at first, just two tiny pinpricks of light, but they were growing rapidly, approaching at an alarming speed. I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine roared, the tires spun briefly on the gravel shoulder, and then I was back on the road, speeding away from the approaching headlights. My phone buzzed again. Another text message. From my own number. Faster. I glanced at the speedometer. 80 miles per hour. 90 miles per hour. 100 miles per hour. The car was vibrating, the engine screaming in protest, but I pushed it harder, faster. The headlights in my rearview mirror were still gaining on me. I couldn't make out the make or model of the vehicle, just two blinding white orbs that seemed to consume the darkness. The static on the radio changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine, a piercing sound that made my teeth ache. Through the whine, I could hear fragments of words, distorted and fragmented, like a broken record. Coming, can't, hide, find you. My hands were slick with sweat, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was a blur, the desert landscape rushing past in a streak of muted colors. I risked another glance at the rearview mirror. The headlights were closer now, close enough that I could feel their heat, their intensity. My phone buzzed again. Turn right. Now, I looked ahead, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was no road, no intersection, nothing but desert. Turn right, into that, I'd be driving straight into a ditch, flipping the car, killing myself. The headlights behind me flared, blindingly bright. The pursuing vehicle was right on my tail, its engine a deafening roar. I had a split second to decide. Trust the message or trust my own eyes. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car careened off the road, bouncing violently as it hit the uneven terrain. I fought to maintain control, my body thrown from side to side, my head snapping back against the headrest. I was expecting to crash, to feel the jarring impact of metal against rock, the shattering of glass, the crushing weight of the car rolling over me. But it didn't happen. Instead, the car continued to move, bumping and jolting, but still upright, still under my control. I looked around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. I was on a dirt road, a narrow, winding track that I could swear hadn't been there a moment ago. In my rearview mirror, I saw the headlights of the pursuing vehicle shoot past the turnoff, continuing down the highway, disappearing into the distance. They hadn't followed me. I slowed the car to a stop, my body trembling, my heart still racing. I checked my phone. The signal was gone. The screen was blank. The radio was silent. No static, no whispers, just the faint hum of the engine. I sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My phone buzzed again. Another text message. From my own number. Get out. Walk 100 paces north. Bring the phone. I stared at the message, my mind reeling. Get out. Walk. Into the desert. In the middle of the night. It was insane. It was suicidal. But the alternative was to go back to the highway, to face whatever had been chasing me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my service weapon, and got out of the car. The desert night was cold, the air crisp and clear. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint crunch of my boots on the gravel. I started walking north, counting my steps, my flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The landscape was desolate, barren, a vast expanse of sand, rock, and scrub brush. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, making the familiar shapes of cacti and Joshua trees seem alien and menacing. 50 paces, 60, 70. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the darkness, my senses on high alert. 80, 90, 95. I was nearing the end of the prescribed distance. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty landscape. Nothing. Then I saw it. A small, wooden cross, stuck in the ground, almost hidden by a cluster of rocks. 100 paces. Exactly. I approached the cross cautiously, my flashlight beam focused on it. It was old, weathered, the wood cracked and faded. A small, tarnished metal plate was nailed to it, bearing an inscription that was almost illegible. I knelt down, bringing the flashlight closer, trying to decipher the words. Here lies David, lost to the highway. The rest of the inscription was obscured by dirt and decay. David, another victim, another driver who had encountered. What? The same thing that had chased me? The same voice that had whispered my name? My phone buzzed again. Another text message. But this time it wasn't from my own number. It was from David. The message was a single word. Run. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the desert, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what was coming. Then I heard it, a low, humming sound, coming from the direction of the highway. It was growing louder, closer, accompanied by the faint glow of headlights. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran back towards my car, my boots pounding on the hard-packed earth, my lungs burning, my heart racing. I could hear the engine now, a powerful, throaty roar that echoed through the silent desert. It was gaining on me, fast. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. I threw open the door, scrambled inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and spun the tires, sending a spray of gravel and dust into the air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached the next town, until I saw the familiar glow of streetlights and the reassuring presence of other people. I abandoned my car at a gas station, leaving the keys in the ignition. I took a bus to the next city, then another and another, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that deserted stretch of Route 60. I threw away my phone, got a new number, a new identity. I tried to forget what had happened, to dismiss it as a hallucination, a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But I couldn't. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. And I knew that somewhere out there, on that lonely stretch of highway, something was waiting. Waiting for the next driver. Waiting for the next victim. Waiting to whisper their name through the static. I started writing everything down, documenting my experience, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a pattern, a reason. I researched Route 60, looking for similar stories, for other reports of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances. I found them, dozens of them. Drivers reporting strange lights, phantom vehicles, disembodied voices on the radio, text messages from their own numbers, cars malfunctioning, electronics failing. And always the static that preceded the terror, the static that carried the whispers, the static that was a warning. I realized, with a growing sense of horror, that I wasn't just a victim. I was a survivor. Someone or something had tried to help me, to warn me, to guide me to safety. The messages, the voice, David. But who was David? And what was the creature on the highway? And why did it want me? I started carrying a small, handheld recorder with me at all times, hoping to capture the voice, the static, any evidence that could prove I wasn't crazy. I started avoiding driving at night, sticking to well-lit city streets, avoiding highways altogether. But the fear, the paranoia, remained. I knew it was still out there, waiting. One evening, several months after my escape, I was walking home from work when my new phone buzzed. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I slowly pulled the phone out of my pocket, my hands trembling. It was a text message from an unknown number. My breath caught in my chest. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Should I open it? Should I ignore it? Curiosity and a morbid sense of dread won out. I opened the message. It was a single sentence. "They're coming for you, Miles. Channel 0. Channel 0. What did that mean? I frantically searched the internet, typing in Channel 0, Route 60, static, highway disappearances. I found nothing, just the usual conspiracy theories, urban legends, and ghost stories. Then, I stumbled upon a small, obscure online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, paranormal encounters, and radio anomalies. And there I found it, a thread titled, "The Static on Channel 0, Route 60. I clicked on the thread, my heart pounding. The first post was from a user named Desert Dreamer. Has anyone else experienced the static on Route 60? It starts around mile marker 147, and it gets worse the closer you get to Miller's Curve. I heard voices, whispers, and then I saw it. A pair of headlights coming up behind me fast. Too fast. I floored it, but they kept gaining. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from my own number. It said, "Turn left." There was no road, just desert. But I turned anyway, and the headlights, they just kept going. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't turned. My blood ran cold. It was my story, almost exactly. I scrolled through the thread, reading other posts, other accounts. I heard my name, whispered through the static. It was terrifying. My car's electronics went haywire. The radio, the GPS, the phone, all dead. I saw a figure, standing by the side of the road. It had no face. The headlights, they were blinding. They followed me for miles. I got a text message from myself. It saved my life. Dozens of stories, all similar, all pointing to the same terrifying conclusion. Something was out there on Route 60. Something that used the static, that used technology to hunt its prey. And something or someone was trying to help. The last post in the thread was from a user named David_1987. I wasn't so lucky. I didn't turn. I didn't listen. They got me, but I left a warning. Across. Mile marker 152. If you see it, run. Don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't listen to the voices. They lie. David, the cross in the desert. It all connected. But who was he? And how did he know? I knew I had to go back. I had to return to Route 60 to find that cross, to understand what had happened to David, and to find a way to stop whatever was out there. I knew it was dangerous, reckless, possibly suicidal, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't live with the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that others might suffer the same fate. Ipektipe, taking everything I thought I might need. My recorder, a flashlight, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and my service weapon, a Glock 19 I had kept from my days on the force. I also took a small, handheld radio, one that operated on a different frequency than cell phones, hoping it might be less susceptible to the static. I drove back to Arizona, back to Route 60. It was late afternoon when I reached the stretch of highway where I had experienced the terror. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. I drove slowly, scanning the roadside, looking for any sign of the cross. Mile marker 147, 148, 149. The static started. Faint at first, a subtle hissing in the background, but growing steadily louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. 150, 151. Then I saw it. A small, wooden cross, standing on the shoulder of the road, almost hidden by a cluster of rocks. Mile marker 152. I pulled over, my car facing away from the curve, my engine running. I grabbed my recorder and turned it on. The static was deafening now, a roaring white noise that filled the car. I got out, my weapon drawn, my flashlight in my other hand. I approached the cross cautiously, my senses on high alert. The air grew colder. The metallic scent I remembered, the scent of the server room and of my own death that never happened, filled my nostrils. I reached the cross. I knelt down, examining it closely. It was old, weathered, the wood cracked and faded. The inscription was barely legible. "Here lies David Marshall, lost to the highway, remembered." I reached out and touched the cross. A jolt of static electricity shot through my hand, making me recoil. Then I heard it, the whisper. But this time it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from everywhere. Miles. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the desert, searching for the source of the voice. Nothing. Then I saw them. Headlights. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Emerging from the darkness. From all directions. Converging on my position. They were moving fast. Too fast. Their engines roaring. Their lights blinding. I was surrounded. Trapped. I raised my weapon, my finger on the trigger, but I knew it was useless. There were too many of them. I couldn't fight them all. The headlights were closing in, forming a tight circle around me, blinding me with their intensity. The static was deafening, a cacophony of whispers and screams and distorted voices. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. This was it. This was the end. Then a new sound, a different sound, a clear, crisp, human voice cutting through the static, through the roar of the engines. "Miles, get down." I opened my eyes, squinting against the glare. I saw a figure standing on the hood of my car, silhouetted against the headlights. It was a woman, tall and slender, holding a device, something that looked like a modified radio antenna, emitting a pulsing blue light. The woman raised the device, pointing it towards the approaching vehicles. A wave of energy, visible as a shimmering distortion in the air, emanated from the antenna, washing over the headlights. The vehicles flickered. Their forms wavered, distorted, like images on a broken television screen. The roaring engines sputtered, died. The headlights dimmed, flickered, then went out. The static ceased. Silence. I lowered my weapon, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The woman jumped down from the hood of my car, approaching me cautiously. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm and reassuring. I nodded slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. Who are you?" I asked. She smiled a small, sad smile. "My name is Sarah," she said, "and I'm David's sister. David, the man who had left the warning, the man who had been lost to the highway. I've been tracking this thing for years," Sarah continued. "Ever since my brother disappeared, I've been trying to find a way to stop it." She gestured towards the device she was holding. "This is a frequency disruptor. It interferes with the energy that powers the vehicles, the projections." "Projections?" I asked, confused. "They're not real cars," Sarah explained. "They're manifestations, projections of fear, of regret, of lost souls, created by the entity that lurks on this highway." "The collector," I said, remembering the words of the voice on the phone. Sarah nodded. "That's one name for it. It's been here for a long time, feeding on the negative energy, on the tragedies that have occurred on this road." "And the static?" I asked. "The whispers. It's a lure," Sarah said. "A way to draw people in, to disorient them, to make them vulnerable." "And the messages?" I asked. "The warnings. Those are residual echoes," Sarah explained. "Fragments of past victims trying to help, to warn others. Like my brother." It all made sense now. The impossible physics, the shifting realities, the whispers, the static, the messages. It was all connected. "We need to destroy it," I said, my voice firm. "We need to end this." Sarah nodded. "I know, but it's not easy. It's powerful, and it's adaptable." She looked out at the dark desert, her expression grim. "We need to find its source," she said. "Its anchor, the place where it's strongest." "Miller's Curve," I said, suddenly remembering the detail from my initial encounter. "And the hitchhiker. That's where I first heard the whispers, where the static was strongest. And it's a place with a history." Sarah nodded. "Then that's where we go." We got into my car, Sarah taking the passenger seat, her frequency disruptor resting on her lap. We drove towards Miller's Curve, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The static returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder as we approached the curve. The radio, which had been silent since my encounter with the vehicles, suddenly crackled to life, emitting a chorus of whispers, screams, and distorted voices. Sarah turned on the frequency disruptor. The blue light pulsed, and the static lessened, but it didn't disappear completely. "It's stronger here," she said, her voice tight. "Much stronger." We reached Miller's Curve. The road twisted sharply, hugging the edge of a steep embankment. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of decay and that metallic tang. We got out of the car, our weapons drawn, my Glock 19 and Sarah's disruptor. The silence, broken only by the faint hum of the disruptor, was unnerving. Then we saw it, a swirling vortex of darkness, coalescing in the center of the road, just at the apex of the curve. It was larger than before, more powerful, more defined. The figure of the shadow man began to emerge from the darkness, its form flickering, wavering, but undeniably present. But this time it wasn't alone. Standing beside it, shrouded in shadow, was another figure, tall, thin, with an outstretched arm. The herder. Two of them, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. The shadow man spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls. "You cannot stop us," it hissed. "We are legion." The herder figure remained silent, its arm still outstretched, pointing, not at us, but at the shadow man. "We know your weakness," I shouted, my voice echoing through the night. "We know how to destroy you." The shadow man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. "You know nothing," it whispered. Sarah raised the frequency disruptor, aiming it at the shadow man. The blue light pulsed faster, brighter. The shadow man recoiled, its form flickering violently. It emitted a high-pitched shriek, a sound of pure agony. But the herder figure, it didn't move. It didn't react. It just stood there, its arm still outstretched, pointing. Then I understood. The herder wasn't protecting the shadow man. It was guiding us. It was showing us its weakness, the outstretched arm, the twisted, broken arm. It wasn't pointing at the shadow man. It was pointing at itself. "Sarah," I shouted, my voice urgent. "The herder. Aim for the herder." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with confusion. But she trusted me. She shifted her aim, pointing the frequency disruptor at the tall, dark figure standing beside the shadow man. The blue light intensified, bathing the herder in its glow. The figure wavered. His form flickered, distorted, like a mirage shimmering in the heat. Then it screamed, not a scream of pain, but a scream of release, a scream of liberation. The figure's form began to unravel, to dissolve, to break apart into swirling shadows, into fragments of darkness. And as it dissolved, the shadow man screamed too. A chorus of screams, a cacophony of agony and despair. His form, which had been flickering before, now began to collapse in on itself, shrinking, twisting, contorting. The darkness that surrounded it dissipated, revealing nothing, just empty space. The static ceased, the whispers faded, the metallic scent vanished. The silence returned, profound and absolute. The herder was gone. The shadow man was gone. Sarah lowered the frequency disruptor, her body trembling, her face pale. What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. "But I think we freed it." We stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the figures had been, trying to comprehend what had just happened. We had faced the darkness, and we had won. But we had also learned a terrible truth. The shadow man hadn't been the true source of the terror. It had been a manifestation, a projection, a puppet. The herder, the figure with the outstretched arm, had been the key. A victim, trapped, forced to serve the darkness, to lure others to their doom. And we had freed it. We had broken the cycle. We drove away from Miller's Curve, leaving the darkness behind. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the desert landscape. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We had shared an experience that had changed us forever, an experience that had bound us together in a way that words could not express. We knew the world was a different place now. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, in the between spaces. But we also knew that there was hope, that even in the darkest of nights, there was always a chance for light, for freedom, for redemption. We had faced the shadow man and we had survived. And that, we realized, was all that mattered. But we also knew that our journey wasn't over. There were other roads, other curves, other figures waiting in the fog. And we would be ready. We would keep watching. We would keep listening. And we would keep fighting. Because some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Some silences needed to be broken, no matter how terrifying they might seem. The static, we were sure, would return. But we were prepared. neighbors from the netherworld. Everyone has that one set of neighbors they love to despise, the ones who seem to exist solely to disrupt the peace and tranquility of the neighborhood. They're the ones who throw wild parties that rage until the early hours, scatter their trash with reckless abandon, and borrow your belongings with no intention of returning them. I've had my fair share of bad neighbors, but the year of hell these particular neighbors inflicted upon my family surpassed anything I could have imagined. It's a story filled with so much chaos and disruption that it's difficult to condense it all, but I'll do my best. The setting: a house directly across the street from ours, a rental property that would become the epicenter of our neighborhood nightmare. We knew the owner of the house, a kind woman named Susan, who would later provide us with valuable insights into the tenants from hell. The first ominous sign appeared when they moved in. They drove their moving truck onto the driveway, a perfectly normal action, but then proceeded to park a rather expensive-looking Lexus on the lawn. It was a clear indication of the type of people we were dealing with, a blatant disregard for basic property etiquette. Parking cars on the lawn became a regular occurrence, eventually killing the grass and creating an unsightly eyesore. Another red flag was the sheer number of people who seemed to come and go from the house. It was impossible to determine the exact number of residents, but the regular cast of characters included an overweight blonde woman, whom I'll call Brenda, a somewhat more presentable brunette with glasses, who I'll name Carol, a hideous, rat-like young man with a punk aesthetic, who we'll refer to as Spike, a teenage girl, thin and gaunt, who looked disturbingly like she was involved in prostitution, who I'll call Tiffany, and two small toddlers, a boy and a girl whose names I never learned. This motley crew quickly established themselves as the loudest, most disruptive force in the neighborhood. Their days and nights were filled with seemingly endless parties and ear-splitting arguments. They possessed the foulest mouths imaginable, spewing profanities with a frequency that was shocking, even to a teenager like myself. Even the youngest child could be heard uttering words that no child should ever know, let alone repeat. Even during the daylight hours, we couldn't open our windows without being subjected to the vulgar music blasting from their open garage door, where one of the teenagers, usually Spike, would be working on a dented, beat-up car. It was a constant assault on our senses. A particularly infuriating aspect of their existence was the neglect of the two small toddlers. They were frequently left outside, unsupervised, in the front yard, for hours on end. These people were clearly living on welfare and other government assistance programs, their lifestyle a stark contrast to the hardworking families in our neighborhood. The most annoying thing, however, began to occur during their first full month of residence. They started asking to borrow things. Carol, the brunette, was usually the one who'd show up at our door, often with a child on her hip and another trailing behind her. First, the requests were relatively innocuous: sugar, eggs, things you might expect a neighbor to borrow in a pinch. My mother, Linda, being the kind and generous soul she is, was reluctant to refuse them. But the requests escalated, becoming increasingly bizarre and demanding. They asked for diapers, an electric griddle, which, surprisingly, they did return, and, on one occasion, they asked if they could charge their phone for a while, claiming their electricity had been shut off due to unpaid bills, a situation that would become a recurring theme. The true highlight of this saga, however, was yet to come. All of the preceding annoyances paled in comparison to what happened next. It was a scorching summer day, the kind of heat that makes you feel sluggish and drained, slowing your movements and clouding your thoughts. I happened to glance out the window, and what I saw sent a surge of horror through me. I witnessed Tiffany, the teenage girl, dragging the screaming toddler boy into the house after he'd been running around outside unsupervised. She slammed the mesh screen door shut behind her, but I could still see her silhouette through the thin screen. And then I saw it. She began kicking the child, repeatedly, her small frame filled with a rage that was both shocking and disturbing. She was yelling at him, calling him all sorts of vile names, her words muffled but still audible through the closed door. I immediately alerted my mother, my voice filled with alarm. She rushed outside, her face a mask of fury, and yelled at Tiffany to stop, threatening to call the police. Tiffany, unfazed, responded with a string of curses, calling my mother nosy and other, more offensive names. She then slammed the main door shut, cutting off the visual but not the sound of the ongoing abuse. My mother, her anger reaching a boiling point, immediately called Child Protective Services, reporting the incident with a mixture of outrage and despair. Shortly thereafter, Brenda, the overweight blonde, along with Spike, her gangly son, and Tiffany, the violent teenager, were pounding on our door, their faces contorted with rage. They were thirsting for confrontation, their anger palpable. My mother, maintaining a remarkable level of composure, slowly drew up the blinds and cracked open the window, making it clear that she wouldn't open the door. Brenda launched into a tirade, yelling at my mother for interfering in their family business, demanding that she F off and mind her own affairs. The verbal assault continued for nearly half an hour, a relentless barrage of curses and threats. My mother, finally reaching her limit, calmly explained that as long as she was forced to witness such cruelty and hear such foul language, she would not stay out of their business. She warned them that if they didn't leave her property immediately, she would call the police. She shut the window and closed the blinds, cutting off the visual, but the sounds of their rage still echoed through the house. Not long after, the police were called again, this time by other neighbors who had also witnessed the family's disturbing behavior. The family was finally issued a warning and an eviction date, but even that didn't stop them. They remained in the house for weeks after their water and power had been shut off, living in squalor, defying the eviction order. When they finally realized that they had to leave or face arrest, they unleashed their fury on the house itself. They did everything in their power to destroy and deface the property. Susan, the landlady, was in tears as she gave my mother a tour of the now vacant house. Windows had been smashed, sinks ripped out and tossed into the yard, walls riddled with holes and covered in vulgar graffiti. The toilets were backed up with human waste, a disgusting testament to their spiteful destruction. Anything they couldn't take with them, they destroyed. It's been some time since that nightmare family moved out, and a new family has since moved into the house. But the memory remains fresh, a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the potential for chaos that can lurk just across the street. I sincerely hope no one ever has to endure the kind of neighborly hell we experienced. Jack's surgical obsession. When I was around 13 or 14, a new student, whom I'll call Jack, arrived at my middle school. Our school was fairly large, situated in a densely populated neighborhood, so the arrival of new students wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Typically, no one made a big deal out of it, but Jack was different. He was noticeably shy, almost painfully so, and he seemed to radiate an aura of awkwardness, of not quite fitting in. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, remembering my own experiences with feeling out of place. So, I decided to approach him, to introduce myself and offer a friendly welcome, a small gesture to ease his transition into a new environment. Little did I know, this seemingly innocuous act of kindness would lead to a series of increasingly bizarre and unsettling encounters. Jack was unusually tall for his age, with a large, almost imposing frame. At first, he didn't come across as creepy, just awkward and a bit socially inept. But then again, awkwardness is practically a defining characteristic of hormone-addled preteens, so his behavior didn't immediately raise any red flags. I don't recall the specifics of our initial conversations, the mundane small talk that typically accompanies new acquaintances. But I do remember that he made a concerted effort to seek me out, to say hello to me, and specifically me. Even if I was surrounded by a group of friends, he'd address me by name, a subtle but noticeable distinction. Looking back, I suspect he might have had a crush on me, but at the time, I was completely oblivious to any romantic overtures. I wasn't particularly interested in boys, and his behavior simply registered as slightly odd, but not necessarily alarming. Things started to get weird during an art class assignment. Our teacher, Mrs. Davis, instructed us to decorate the covers of our sketch pads with something that represented our passions, our interests, something that truly resonated with us. Most of my classmates chose typical teenage themes, favorite bands, sports teams, video game characters. My own cover probably featured some angsty band I was listening to at the time. Jack's cover, however, was different. It was a photograph of an open heart surgery. Not an illustration, not a stylized depiction, but an actual graphic photograph of a human heart exposed and vulnerable during a surgical procedure. The teacher, along with everyone else who saw it, was understandably disturbed. It was a jarring, unsettling image, completely out of place in a middle school art class. Mrs. Davis likely had a private conversation with him about his choice, but as far as I remember, he was allowed to keep the image on his sketchpad, despite its graphic nature. Later, I approached Jack, my curiosity piqued, and asked him why he'd chosen that particular image. He explained, with a disconcerting level of enthusiasm, that he was deeply fascinated by cardiology, that he spent hours watching surgery videos online, and that he aspired to study it in college. It was still a strange choice, especially the graphic nature of the image, but his explanation provided a semblance of context, a glimpse into his unusual passion. Or so I thought. In the weeks that followed, Jack's behavior became increasingly erratic and unsettling. He started claiming that he was working a part-time internship at a local hospital, a position he'd supposedly secured through his grandmother, who he claimed was a nurse there. He boasted about his access to the medical world, his supposed involvement in procedures that were far beyond the scope of any 13-year-old. He even went so far as to wear scrubs to school one day, a blatant attempt to bolster his fabricated narrative. It was obviously a lie. No hospital in their right mind would allow a 13-year-old to participate in any medical capacity, let alone surgical procedures. It was a preposterous claim, but Jack seemed to believe it, or at the very least, he believed that I would believe it. I was constantly trying to assess what was going on inside his mind. One day, he asked me if I wanted to see some of the tools they used at the hospital. Partly out of morbid curiosity and partly out of a growing fear of what might happen if I didn't play along. Agreed. And, to my utter astonishment, he actually brought a collection of medical instruments to school. Scalpels, scissors, forceps. The kid had a complete dissection kit in his backpack. I have no idea where he obtained these items. Did he purchase them? Did he steal them from his grandmother, assuming she actually was a nurse? I leaned towards the latter explanation, but the truth remained elusive. The sheer audacity of bringing these potentially dangerous instruments to school, of all places, was staggering. I still don't understand his rationale. Perhaps he thought it was his only opportunity to impress me with his supposed medical expertise, since we never interacted outside of school. In retrospect, I'm incredibly grateful that we didn't spend time together outside of school. I, of course, pretended to be impressed, feigning interest in his tools and his fabricated stories. But inside, I was terrified. I immediately reported the incident to the principal, my fear outweighing any loyalty I might have felt towards Jack. The principal, understandably alarmed, contacted Jack's grandmother, who was just as shocked and bewildered as everyone else to learn of her grandson's actions. I don't know the specifics of the disciplinary measures taken, but as far as I remember, Jack faced minimal consequences. It was near the end of the school year, and shortly thereafter, I moved to a different school for unrelated reasons, effectively ending my interactions with him. Thankfully, he never attempted to harm me or anyone else, as far as I know. I believe he genuinely thought it was acceptable, even impressive, to bring a collection of potential weapons to school. But I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I'd angered him, if I hadn't pretended to go along with his delusional world. He was notoriously volatile, and I consider myself fortunate to have escaped his orbit unscathed. I suspect he was struggling with mental illness. I know he was dealing with depression because I was too at the time and we briefly discussed it. But looking back, it's clear he was also delusional, living in a fabricated reality that bore little resemblance to the truth. This all happened almost a decade ago, a time when mental health issues were often stigmatized and swept under the rug. The school likely didn't investigate the situation thoroughly, or provide Jack and his family with the support and resources they needed. It's a sad reality, a reflection of a societal failure to address mental health with the seriousness it deserves. So yeah, creepy kid from middle school, I sincerely hope you're doing better now, but I'll never forget our interactions, and not in a good way. It was a chilling, unsettling experience, a reminder of the hidden struggles that can lurk beneath the surface and the potential dangers of unchecked delusion. The heavy breather. A few days ago, I was walking downtown during the mid-afternoon, enjoying a rare break in my hectic work schedule. It was a busy city street, crowded with pedestrians, the usual hustle and bustle of urban life. As I walked, I became aware of a presence behind me. It wasn't a visual awareness, but rather a sense, a feeling of being followed. Again, it's a busy street, so I didn't pay it much mind, but this man stayed directly behind me for several blocks. I could hear his breathing, which was becoming increasingly ragged and coarse. It was heavy, labored breathing, growing more pronounced with each step. I didn't want to turn around to make eye contact. I didn't want to acknowledge his presence, to give him any indication that I was aware of him. But I could feel him following me, his presence a palpable weight on my back. Then I heard him speak. "Honey," he said, his voice raspy and close. "If you don't slow down, I'll never catch up to you." Terror surged through me. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, ready to confront him, to demand an explanation. He was big, imposing, at least a foot taller than me, and on his chest, I saw it a sticky paper ID tag, the kind used for visitors or patients. It was from a mental hospital. A mental patient had been following me for blocks, his breathing heavy and labored, and he was now trying to get me to slow down. I turned away, immediately crossing the street, putting as much distance as possible between us. I didn't look back, but I didn't hear him following me any further. He seemed to have stopped his pursuit at that point. The incident left me deeply shaken, my heart pounding, my mind racing. That's how the story would be told if I were that woman. But I'm not. I'm the guy. And this is the story of how I accidentally became the subject of someone else's let's not meet story. A terrifying misunderstanding born from a series of unfortunate coincidences. I had been out of the office for over a week, battling a nasty bout of bronchitis that had completely knocked me off my feet. My girlfriend, bless her heart, had nursed me back to health, patiently tending to my needs. And now, she was the one who was sick, stuck at home, feeling miserable. This was my first day back at work, and I felt terrible leaving her. I wanted to do something nice for her, a small gesture to show my appreciation and lift her spirits. She's an avid gamer, a dedicated player of The Elder Scrolls Online. The game had recently released a new expansion, which included a new character class she was eager to try. But she'd put off purchasing the expansion, focusing on taking care of me during my illness. So I decided to surprise her. On my lunch break, I'd go to the nearest GameStop and buy her the digital code for the expansion. My lunch break arrived, and I set off. Now, here's the thing. The local GameStop and my office building are located on opposite sides of a very large, steep hill. And remember, I was still recovering from bronchitis. I reached the GameStop, purchased the digital code, and texted her a picture of it, along with a joking message. "You better wait until I get home to play this, or I'll never catch up." Then, I started the arduous trek back to the office, heading uphill. And that's when the combination of heat, humidity, and my still recovering lungs began to take its toll. I started breathing heavily, audibly wheezing with each step. And, as fate would have it, I happened to be walking the exact same path as a woman who was a short distance ahead of me. I'd now been walking behind her for a couple of blocks, my heavy breathing, I'm sure, becoming increasingly noticeable. Two important details about me. First, I'm a tech enthusiast. I wear a smartwatch, Bluetooth earbuds, the whole 9 yards. Second, I'm a big guy, 6'2", 240 pounds. A former college athlete who still maintains a regular workout routine. I'm a scary-looking individual. I am actually a gentle giant, but I'm fully aware that, in the wrong context, I could be perceived as intimidating. So what's the tech relevance? Smartwatch, Bluetooth earbuds. My girlfriend called me. I tapped on my smartwatch to answer the call without ever taking my phone out of my pocket. The call was automatically routed to my Bluetooth earbuds. My girlfriend, hearing the audible chime on her end, indicating that I'd answered, immediately launched into an excited account of how she couldn't wait and had already started playing the new expansion without me. And that's when I, jokingly, said, "Honey, if you don't slow down, I'll never catch up." The woman ahead of me, understandably, freaked out. She whipped around, her eyes wide with fear, and that's when I realized, with a sickening jolt of understanding, that she thought I was talking to her. I wasn't holding a phone. I'd been following her for blocks, audibly wheezing, and I just uttered a phrase that, in her context, sounded incredibly threatening. Then I realized something else. Remember how I said it was my first day back at work? I was still feeling the effects of the bronchitis, and, in my weakened state, I'd forgotten my work ID at home. I now work in a highly secure government building, the kind of place that doesn't just let you in, even if all the security guards know your face from years of employment. No ID, no entry. You have to undergo a thorough security screening, let's just call it an ear cavity search level screening, and wait for human resources to verify your employment status. But once you've endured your morning humiliation, they do provide you with a temporary visitor badge, a sticky paper tag that allows you to come and go throughout the day without repeated violations of your personal space. And this little sticky badge, which I still had affixed to my chest, displayed the name of the government agency I worked for. What agency is that? The Department of Mental Health. Because I, despite my imposing physical appearance, am a lawyer, the Regional Legal Director and Deputy Chief Counsel for the State Office of Health and Human Services. Her eyes moved to the badge, and she froze, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. Then, without a word, she turned and quickly hurried down a side street, disappearing from view. It was at that moment that I said to my girlfriend, my voice laced with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement, "I think some lady just thought I was trying to kidnap her." So, to the downtown lady who I inadvertently terrified, I offer my sincerest apologies. I'm pretty sure you thought I was some heavy-breathing, perverted mental patient, rather than a government bureaucrat who was simply trying to do something nice for his girlfriend on his lunch break while vastly overestimating his own physical capabilities. Let's not meet again, because I'm afraid your heart might not be able to take it. And again, I'm truly sorry. The post office predicament. This story, while seemingly simple, carries a weight of fear and lingering questions that have stayed with me for years. I normally try to give my mother, Margaret, the benefit of the doubt, but as I've grown older, I find myself questioning her actions, or rather, her inaction on that particular day. Perhaps it's the hindsight of adulthood, the understanding of the potential dangers that lurked in the shadows of my childhood. I'd say I was around 8 years old at the time. Back then, we didn't have mail delivered directly to our house. We had to retrieve it from the post office in town. It was a routine task usually performed by my mother. But, as children often do, I developed a fascination with this seemingly mundane chore. I saw my mother retrieving the mail, and in my childish mind, I equated it with maturity, with responsibility. I wanted to be cool like my mom, so I began begging her to let me get the mail. I pestered her relentlessly, my persistence fueled by that youthful desire to prove my independence. Eventually, she relented. Now, to the actual story. I believe it was a weekend because the post office itself was closed. However, the lobby area, where the mailboxes were located, remained accessible. You could still retrieve your mail, but there were no postal workers present. I remember asking my mother if I could get the mail as we slowly pulled up outside the post office. She, without hesitation, handed me the keys, a jangling collection that included the key to our mailbox. I jumped out of our old van, my excitement bubbling over, and ran up the ramp leading to the building, skipping the stairs entirely. I opened the door and stepped into the quiet lobby. I saw a woman and a man retrieving their mail, their presence reassuringly normal. But then I noticed him, an older man, sitting in a corner, staring at me. Even as a child, I sensed something unsettling about him. He gave me weird vibes, as we'd say now, but still I did what I thought was polite. I gave him a quick smile and a wave. It was a mistake. The man smiled back, revealing stained, yellowed teeth. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a crooked, unsettling expression that sent a shiver down my spine. But I was focused on my mission, my desire to prove my maturity. I walked past him, heading towards the rows of mailboxes. I fumbled with the keys, my childish hands struggling to identify the correct one. The other people in the lobby finished retrieving their mail and left, leaving me alone with the staring man. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 to 5 minutes, I finally managed to unlock our mailbox. I was elated, a small victory in my quest for independence. I disregarded the man's continued gaze as I gathered the mail. With a quick click of the lock, I closed the mailbox and turned to leave. I could still feel the man's eyes on me, his unsettling smile lingering in my peripheral vision. It's a look that, even now, decades later, gives me chills. I put my open hand against the door, ready to push it open, when suddenly, a pair of arms reached around me. One hand forcefully pulled the door shut, preventing my escape. The other arm wrapped around my upper chest, near my collarbone, pulling me back into a tight, unwelcome, and utterly terrifying hug. I froze. What was I supposed to do? I'd been taught to respect adults, to be polite. But this was anything but polite. This was terrifying. He smelled strongly of alcohol, a pungent, overwhelming odor that made me cough. He began to speak, his voice low and slurred, after a moment of simply holding me captive. The words he spoke were fragmented, disjointed, but the underlying tone was menacing, threatening. I only remember snippets of what he said, and I wish I could forget even those. "Hey, where you going?" he asked, his voice almost passive-aggressive. "Oh, I have to go," I stammered, my voice trembling. "My mom is waiting for me." "Oh, okay, he said, sounding defeated. He began to loosen his grip, as if he were about to let me go. But then, before I could break free, he tightened his hold again, pulling me even closer. Wait, he said. "I have a dog, you know." He had that same creepy grin, and it had only grown. "Oh, that's cool," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, desperately trying to conceal my growing fear. Yeah, you should come with me, and you can play with him." The scary thing is, for a fleeting moment I almost considered it. I was a child, easily swayed by the promise of playing with a dog. The next 8 minutes felt like an eternity. He kept repeating the cycle, loosening his grip, then tightening it again, preventing my escape. His scruffy beard and dirty coat brushed against me, adding to my discomfort and fear. The details are hazy, blurred by the passage of time and the trauma of the experience, but the underlying terror remains vivid. He kept telling me no, almost ordering me to go with him. Finally, he seemed to snap, his demeanor shifting from vaguely persuasive to overtly aggressive. "All right, you're coming with me," he declared, his voice firm, resolute. "What?" I exclaimed, my fear reaching a peak. "But I need my mom. I have her keys, and she's waiting for me. Please." My priorities, even in that moment of terror, were still focused on my mother, on the keys, on the mail. "Nope, you're coming with me now," he insisted. He opened the door and began to pull me outside. But in that moment, in a flicker of his weakened grip, I found my chance. I broke free, sprinting towards my mother's van, my heart pounding, my legs pumping. I slammed the car door shut, startling my brother and my mother. I started shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face, dropping the mail onto the car floor. My sister, Olivia, picked it up and handed everything to my mother, as she demanded to know what had happened. I told her everything, my voice choked with sobs, recounting the terrifying encounter. She looked furious, and I, For a moment, felt a surge of relief, believing she was on my side. I looked outside, tears still blurring my vision, and saw the man. He was looking at me through the car window, standing at the top of the ramp leading to the post office. I started to cry even harder, panicking, as he began to approach the van. My mother stopped me, and then she said something that, to this day, I struggle to understand. She claimed he was completely harmless. She said he had fallen at the bottom of the ramp, that he had tripped. She laughed at the man who had just terrified me, who had tried to abduct me. She started the car and drove away, attempting to comfort me with words that felt hollow and dismissive. "He was just a harmless old drunk guy," she said. "He didn't hurt you." Years later, I brought up the incident to my father, Daniel, when I was visiting his house. To my surprise, he had no knowledge of it. My mother had never told him. He was angry, understandably so, but I calmed him down, urging him not to confront my mother about it. He was furious that my mother hadn't intervened sooner, that she hadn't taken the situation more seriously. More recently, I brought it up with my mother again. Her response was even more disturbing. She accused me of being a drama queen, of exaggerating the situation. She insisted that I was never in any real danger, that the man had never tried anything. I was furious, but I held my tongue. Now, I'm left with a lingering sense of confusion and betrayal. I know his slurring was from drinking, but his tone was demanding, spiteful almost. My questions remain unanswered. What were his intentions? Was he truly harmless, as my mother claimed? Or was I, as a child, in far greater danger than she realized? And, perhaps most importantly, do I have the right to be angry, to feel betrayed by my mother's dismissive attitude? The uncertainty, the lack of closure, continues to haunt me. The chimes of Candlestick Cove. The sound woke me, a delicate, crystalline chime that seemed to drift on the night air. It was 2:47 a.m., according to the illuminated display of my bedside clock. I, Dr. Thomas Ashton, a recently retired professor of folklore, had moved to Candlestick Cove, Maine, seeking peace and quiet, a respite from the relentless pressures of academia. I had not expected this. I sat up in bed, listening intently. My wife, Beatrice, stirred beside me but didn't wake. She was a heavy sleeper, bless her. The chimes continued, a gentle melodic ringing that seemed to come from outside. I got out of bed, my bare feet padding softly on the hardwood floor. I walked to the bedroom window, peering out into the darkness. My new home, a quaint, two-story cottage overlooking the rocky coastline, was shrouded in a thick, pre-dawn fog. The only visible light came from the moon, a pale sliver hanging low in the sky, and the distant, rhythmic flash of the Candlestick Point Lighthouse. I could see nothing in my yard. No movement, no source for the sound. I dismissed it as my imagination, perhaps the distant sound of buoy bells carried on the wind. I was, after all, a scholar of folklore, prone to flights of fancy, to seeing patterns and meaning where others saw only randomness. I returned to bed, pulling the covers up around me, trying to fall back asleep. But the chimes continued, persistent, insistent, refusing to be ignored, and they were getting louder. The next night, the chimes woke me again. 3:12 a.m. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was clear, distinct, metallic. Wind chimes. But I didn't own any wind chimes, and neither did my immediate neighbors. I had made a point of introducing myself to them when I moved in, taking note of their gardens, their houses, their lack of wind chimes. I got out of bed again, my heart pounding with a growing sense of unease. I walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The fog was thicker tonight, a dense, swirling blanket that obscured everything beyond a few feet. I could barely see the outline of my own backyard, let alone the neighboring properties. But the chimes were louder, closer, seemingly right outside my window. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the old oak tree, The oak tree at the edge of my property, a massive, ancient specimen that dominated the backyard. Its branches, gnarled and twisted, reached out like skeletal arms, disappearing into the fog. I hesitated. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, playing tricks on my ears. But a deeper, more primal instinct warned me that something was wrong. I pulled on a robe and slippers, grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table, and headed downstairs. The house was silent. The only sound, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the increasingly insistent ringing of the chimes. Beatrice, thankfully, remained asleep. I unlocked the back door and stepped out into the night. The cold, damp air hit me like a physical blow. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating, limiting visibility to just a few feet. The scent of salt and seaweed hung heavy in the air. The chimes were louder now, clearer, a delicate, metallic melody that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. I walked towards the oak tree, my flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. The sound grew stronger with each step, guiding me, pulling me forward. I reached the tree, its massive trunk looming before me like a dark, forbidding monolith. I shone my flashlight upwards, into the branches, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw them, hanging from one of the lower branches, just barely visible through the swirling fog, was a set of wind chimes. But they weren't ordinary wind chimes. These were different. They were long and slender, made of a silvery metal that seemed to shimmer in the faint moonlight. There were at least a dozen of them, suspended from a circular wooden frame, and they were moving, swaying, clinking together, despite the complete absence of wind. I stared at them, mesmerized, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never seen chimes like these before. They were beautiful and terrifying. I took a step closer, reaching out to touch them. As my fingers brushed against the cold metal, I noticed something else. The chimes were covered in markings, strange, intricate symbols that I didn't recognize. They seemed to shift and change as the chimes moved, as if they were alive. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, seemingly carried on the wind, yet coming from the chimes themselves. Thomas, my name, spoken by a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. A voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, from the heart of the ancient oak. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my flashlight falling from my grasp and clattering on the ground. The chimes continued to ring, their melody now louder, more insistent, almost demanding. I scrambled to retrieve my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I shone the beam back up at the chimes, my heart pounding in my chest. They were still there, still swaying, still ringing, their silvery surfaces gleaming in the light. The symbols on them seemed to pulse, to writhe, to breathe. And the whisper continued, more distinct now, more urgent. Thomas, listen. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my house, to the warmth of my bed. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The fog began to swirl faster, thicker, obscuring the chimes, the tree, the entire backyard. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The chimes continued to ring, their melody now a frantic, discordant cacophony that made my teeth ache. And then I saw it, a darkness, deeper than the fog, deeper than the night, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light, to swallow it whole. It was coalescing beneath the oak tree, spreading outwards, growing larger, taller, took on a shape, a form, tall, thin, with limbs that were too long, too slender, a head that was too small, perched atop a long, sinuous neck, and no face, just a blank, featureless void where a face should be. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the source of the whispers, the source of the chimes, the source of the wrongness that had permeated my peaceful retirement. It was something ancient, something powerful, something evil. Took a step towards me, its movements slow and deliberate, yet somehow fluid, graceful. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I was paralyzed, trapped by a fear so profound it stole my breath, my voice, my will. The figure raised its arm, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal. And then it spoke. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls, a symphony of despair. Thomas, you have been chosen. Chosen? For what? I didn't have time to ask. The figure lunged. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, falling heavily to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam extinguished as it hit the earth. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, my lungs burning. I had to get away, had to escape. But the figure was too fast. It glided across the ground, its movements silent and effortless, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I turned and ran, blindly, through the fog, my only guide the faint, rhythmic flash of the Candlestick Point Lighthouse in the distance. I could hear the chimes behind me, growing fainter, but still present, still haunting. And I could hear the whisper, pursuing me, relentless in its pursuit. Thomas, you cannot escape. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I could run no more. I collapsed on the rocky beach, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The fog was thinner here, closer to the water. I could see the waves crashing against the shore, the white foam illuminated by the moon. I looked back towards my house, towards the oak tree, but I could see nothing, just the dense, swirling fog. The chimes were gone. The whisper had faded. I was alone, for now. I knew I couldn't go back there. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening, what that thing was, what it wanted. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the beach, shivering in the cold, waiting for the dawn. As the sun rose, casting its golden rays over the ocean, I made a decision. I would not be a victim. I would not be driven from my home. I would fight. I would use my knowledge, my research, my understanding of folklore and mythology to uncover the truth, to find a way to defeat the creature that haunted my backyard. I would return to the oak tree. I would face the darkness, and I would, somehow, silence the chimes of Candlestick Cove. My retirement, it seemed, was over. My new quest had begun, and it was far more terrifying than anything I had ever encountered in the dusty pages of ancient texts. The chimes were a warning, and I had to heed it. I spent the day at the local library, researching the history of Candlestick Cove, delving into old records, newspaper archives, and local legends. I discovered that the area had a long and troubled past, a history steeped in tales of shipwrecks, unexplained disappearances, and strange occurrences. The oak tree in my backyard, I learned, was ancient, far older than the town itself. It was known locally as the Whispering Oak, and it was said to be cursed. According to local folklore, the tree was a focal point for something. Something dark, something powerful, something that had been dormant for centuries, but was now awakening. The chimes, the legends said, were a warning, a harbinger of doom. I found several accounts of people who had heard the chimes, who had seen the figure, who had vanished. Their stories were chillingly similar to my own, filled with descriptions of the fog, the darkness, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. I also found references to a local Native American tribe, the Wampanoag, who had inhabited the area long before the arrival of European settlers. They had their own legends about the oak tree, about a spirit that dwelled within it, a spirit that demanded respect, that demanded sacrifice. The Wampanoag had performed rituals at the tree, offerings to appease the spirit, to keep it dormant. But the rituals had stopped centuries ago, when the tribe had been driven from their land. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the creature I had encountered was not just a figment of folklore. It was real, and it was connected to the oak tree, to the chimes, to the history of Candlestick Cove. I needed to find out more about the Wampanoag rituals, about the spirit that dwelled within the tree, about how to stop it. I spent the next few days tracking down descendants of the Wampanoag tribe, seeking their knowledge, their wisdom. It was a difficult task, met with suspicion and reluctance. But eventually, I found an elder, a woman named Sarah Redfeather, who agreed to speak with me. Sarah was old, her face etched with the wisdom of generations, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. She listened patiently as I told her my story, about the chimes, the figure, the darkness. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "The whispering oak," she said, her voice raspy with age. "It remembers. It always remembers." She told me the story of the spirit, a being of immense power, a guardian of the land that had been angered by the arrival of the settlers, by the disrespect shown to the sacred ground. The spirit had demanded sacrifice, blood, to appease its wrath. The Wampanoag had performed rituals, offerings to keep it contained, to keep it asleep. But the rituals had stopped, and now the spirit was awakening. "The chimes," Sarah said, "are a warning, a call. It is seeking a vessel, a body to inhabit, a way to return to the physical world." "And the figure?" I asked. "The one I saw?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "A shadow," she said, "a fragment of its power, a hunter. Can it be stopped?" I asked, my voice filled with a desperate hope. Sarah hesitated. "Perhaps," she said, "but it will require sacrifice." Sacrifice. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I knew what she meant. It wasn't about offering trinkets or flowers. It was about something far more substantial. "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "The spirit demands life," she said. "A life for a life." My blood ran cold. I understood now. The chimes, the whispers, the figure. It was all a prelude to something far more terrifying. The spirit wasn't just hunting. It was choosing. It was selecting its next victim. And I was on its list. "There is another way," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "A ritual. A Wampanoag ritual passed down through generations. It is dangerous, complex, and it may not work, but it is the only chance." She told me about the ritual, about the specific herbs, the chants, the symbols that were needed. It was a ritual of binding, of containment, designed to force the spirit back into its slumber, to seal it within the oak tree once more. But it required a catalyst, something to focus the energy, to amplify the power of the ritual. "The chimes," Sarah said, "they are the key. They are connected to the spirit, to its power. You must use them, but be warned. They are also dangerous. They can corrupt. They can consume." I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the oak tree. I had to retrieve the chimes, and I had to perform the ritual. It was a desperate gamble, a terrifying risk, but it was the only chance I had, the only chance to save myself, to save Candlestick Cove from the darkness that lurked within the whispering oak. That night, under the cover of a new moon, I returned to my home. The fog was thick, swirling, a suffocating blanket that muffled all sound. The chimes were ringing, louder than ever before, a frantic, discordant symphony of metallic sound that filled the night. I approached the oak tree, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. I carried a bag containing the herbs Sarah had given me, a silver knife, and a copy of the ancient Wampanoag text. Its pages filled with strange symbols and forgotten words. The figure was there, waiting, standing beneath the oak tree, its form shrouded in shadow, its faceless void staring up at the chimes. It didn't move. It didn't speak. Just waited. I knew I couldn't confront it directly. Not yet. I had to focus on the chimes. I reached up, my hand trembling, and grasped one of the silver tubes. A jolt of energy, cold and powerful, shot through my arm. I gasped, recoiling, but I didn't let go. The chimes rang louder, their melody twisting, distorting, becoming a cacophony of pain and rage. The symbols on the tubes began to glow, a faint, bluish-white light that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. I felt a presence, a force, pressing against my mind, trying to enter, to control, to consume. I resisted, focusing all my will, all my strength on the ritual, on the words of the incantation. I began to chant, my voice shaky at first, then gaining strength as I repeated the ancient words, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on my tongue, yet somehow profoundly right. As I chanted, I began to draw the symbols Sarah had shown me, tracing them in the air with the silver knife, the blade gleaming in the faint moonlight. The air around me crackled with energy, a tangible force that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The chimes rang louder, their sound reaching a fever pitch, a deafening shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The dark figure beneath the tree began to writhe, to twist, to convulse, as if in agony. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The fog swirled faster, thicker, obscuring everything except the chimes, the figure, and the faint, pulsing glow of the symbols I was drawing. I continued chanting, my voice rising above the chaos, the words of the incantation pouring from my lips, a desperate plea to the ancient spirits, to the forces of nature, to anything that could hear me. Then I felt it, connection, a surge of power, flowing through me, through the knife, through the symbols, into the chimes. The chimes began to glow brighter, their silvery surfaces radiating a blinding light. The symbols on them pulsed, throbbed, then exploded. A wave of energy, pure and white, erupted from the chimes, washing over the oak tree, over the dark figure, over the entire backyard. The figure screamed, a chorus of screams, a cacophony of agony and despair. Its form began to unravel, to dissolve, to break apart into swirling shadows, into fragments of darkness. The chimes shattered, their fragments falling to the ground like shards of glass. The fog dissipated, revealing the clear night sky, the moon shining brightly overhead. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted, drained, my body trembling uncontrollably. The figure was gone. The chimes were gone. The darkness was gone. I had done it. I had performed the ritual. I had banished the spirit. But as I looked at the oak tree, its branches now bare, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky, I knew it wasn't over. The tree remained. The history remained. The potential for darkness remained. I had won this battle, but the war was far from over. I would keep the silver knife and practice the chant. The fight was arduous, but worth it. The darkness would always be a threat, so I had to be ready. The echo in the abandoned arcade. The high-pitched, almost manic laughter sliced through the thick, expectant silence of the deserted Starlight Galleria Mall. It bounced off the vacant storefronts and echoed down the empty corridors, a sound entirely out of place at precisely 11:47 p.m. The noise hit William Bill Foster, the night security guard, like a physical blow, stopping him dead in his tracks. His flashlight beam, previously tracing patterns on the cracked and dusty linoleum floor, snapped upwards, searching. Bill wasn't a coward. 8 years patrolling the mostly thriving sections of the Starlight Galleria had exposed him to the occasional rowdy teenager, the rare vagrant seeking shelter, and once, a surprisingly organized group of raccoons attempting to break into a pretzel stand. But this was different. The West Wing, his current assignment, had been condemned. Slated for demolition within weeks, it was a graveyard of commerce, a mausoleum of forgotten trends. Management, in their infinite and often inscrutable wisdom, had requested a final sweep before the construction crews began their preparatory work the next day. This meant Bill, armed with nothing more than a heavy-duty flashlight and a walkie-talkie that crackled more than it communicated, was the sole human presence in a space choked with the ghosts of failed businesses and forgotten dreams. The West Wing had been sealed off for over 3 years. Every store was vacant, their metal security gates pulled down like eyelids over unseeing eyes. Thick plastic sheeting, secured with industrial tape, obscured the display windows, giving the impression of something vaguely sinister lurking beneath. The air hung heavy, thick with the musty scent of dust, decaying fabric, and something else, a faint, almost metallic odor that Bill couldn't quite place. His boots echoed loudly as he walked, the sound swallowed and regurgitated by the vast emptiness. The only other illumination came from the emergency exit signs, casting the corridor in a sickly crimson glow, making the shadows stretch and writhe like living things. He really wished maintenance had left the normal lights on. The laughter came again, feminine certainly, but with a chilling edge. It seemed to emanate from Forever Young, a defunct clothing boutique approximately 30 feet ahead. Bill's scalp prickled with 1,000 tiny needles, and the fine hairs on his forearms lifted. This wasn't the mischievous giggle of teenagers or the drunken cackle of a lost soul. This was wrong, too sharp, too brittle, too present for this echoing, empty space. He'd encountered trespassers before, bored teenagers seeking a thrill, filming their exploits for social media. Homeless individuals desperate for a warm, dry place to sleep. But the West Wing was secured. Every entrance was chained, padlocked, and reinforced. Bill himself had meticulously checked each one at the beginning of his shift, a process he repeated nightly with almost ritualistic precision. His flashlight beam illuminated the storefront of Forever Young. The security gate was firmly in place, its heavy steel links forming an impenetrable barrier. The display windows were obscured by thick, black plastic, taped securely around the edges. There were no visible gaps, no tears, no conceivable way for anyone to get inside. Another burst of laughter, closer this time, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. His mouth felt like cotton, his forehead slick with a cold sweat that defied the stagnant, surprisingly cool air of the abandoned wing. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking softly against the grimy floor. "Security!" Bill called out, surprised and slightly proud that his voice held steady, betraying only a hint of the tremor he felt. "This area is restricted. Come out with your hands visible." The laughter abruptly ceased. A profound, unsettling silence descended, broken only by the frantic hammering of Bill's own heart, which seemed to echo in the vast emptiness like a drum. He moved closer to the storefront, his flashlight beam meticulously scanning for any indication of a breach. The gate remained intact. The plastic sheeting was undisturbed, but as he drew nearer, he noticed something peculiar about the darkness behind the windows. It was deeper, more absolute than it should have been. It seemed to absorb light, refusing to yield any detail. A faint scraping sound, like heavy furniture being dragged across a hard surface, emanated from within the store. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, measured. They were approaching the front of the store, heading straight towards him. Bill's hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to his belt, but he hesitated. What could he possibly report? "I heard laughter in a sealed-off store?" That would earn him nothing but ridicule from his colleagues and a permanent spot on the Crazy Bill list. The footsteps stopped, directly on the other side of the security gate. Bill raised his flashlight higher, trying to peer through the narrow spaces between the metal links. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice gaining a bit more strength. "Identify yourself." A soft thud against the gate made him jump back, a gasp escaping his lips. Then another and another. It sounded like someone idly tapping their fingers, one by one, against the cold steel. The laughter began again, but it was different now. No longer high-pitched and sharp, it was low, guttural, a disturbing, liquid sound that seemed to seep from the very walls. Bill, despite his better judgment, started backing away, his hand finally reaching for his radio. Static erupted from the speaker as he keyed the microphone. "Control, this is Foster in the West Wing. I have a possible..." He paused, his mind blanking. A possible what? The tapping continued, now moving across the gate from left to right, a methodical, unsettling rhythm. Then, a new sound joined the chorus, a long, drawn-out scraping, like nails dragging across metal, sending a shiver of pure ice down Bill's spine. "Foster, repeat your last..." The radio squawked, the dispatcher's voice distorted and fragmented. "You're breaking up." The black plastic sheeting behind the gate began to bulge outward, just slightly at first, as if something were pressing against it from the inside. "I need backup in the West Wing," Bill said, his voice now tight with barely controlled panic. "Now!" The radio responded with nothing but static, a hissing, crackling void. It was dead. The bulge in the plastic grew larger, more pronounced. The tapping ceased, replaced by a wet, sliding sound that made Bill's stomach churn. His flashlight beam trembled violently, mirroring the tremor in his hand. "Bill!" The voice was a mere whisper, barely audible above the static from his useless radio, but he heard it. His name, coming from behind that gate. His legs felt like water. How could it know his name? His rational mind, desperately seeking an explanation, offered up the name tag on his uniform. But that provided no comfort, no solace, as he watched the plastic sheeting stretch further, distorting into an impossible, horrifying shape. It was like a face pressing through a thin membrane. Features began to emerge in the warped plastic, the suggestion of eyes, a nose, and a mouth stretched wide in a grotesque, mocking grin. The black material, stretched to its limit, grew thinner, almost translucent. Bill ran. His boots pounded against the grimy linoleum floor as he sprinted back the way he had come. A blind, desperate flight fueled by pure terror. The laughter, that low, guttural chuckle, echoed behind him, seemingly amplified by the empty corridors, chasing him like a predatory beast. The emergency exit signs cast a bloody, pulsating light, turning the familiar hallway into a nightmarish hellscape. He rounded a corner, his momentum carrying him forward, and slammed violently into a discarded display kiosk, the impact sending a jolt of searing pain through his hip. The flashlight flew from his grasp, clattering across the floor, its beam spinning wildly before sputtering and dying, plunging that section of the hallway into near-total darkness. Cursing under his breath, Bill pushed himself up, his hand instinctively going to the throbbing pain in his hip. The laughter was closer now, and he could hear the distinct sound of running footsteps, not the measured, deliberate steps from before, but a rapid, frantic pursuit. They were far too fast, too unnatural to belong to any human. The exit door, his beacon of hope, stood at the far end of the corridor, its red sign glowing dimly in the oppressive darkness. Approximately 50 feet. He could make it. He had to make it. Something cold, something indescribably wrong, brushed against the back of his neck. It felt like fingers, but elongated, impossibly thin, and frigid, like the touch of death itself. Bill summoned a burst of speed he didn't know he possessed, sprinting with a desperate, animalistic urgency. The exit sign grew larger with each stride. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. He slammed into the crash bar with the full force of his body, bursting through the door and into the relatively warm embrace of the night air. He didn't stop running, didn't even slow down, until he reached the security office in the still active east wing of the mall, collapsing into a chair, his body trembling uncontrollably. The overnight supervisor, a bored-looking man named Arthur Jenkins, found him there 20 minutes later, still shaking, his uniform soaked with sweat. Bill, his voice hoarse and unsteady, tried to explain what had happened, stammering about seeing someone trying to break in, that he'd given chase. Arthur, his expression skeptical, simply nodded, made a perfunctory note in the logbook, and instructed Bill to finish his shift in the relative safety of the office. Bill didn't argue. He spent the rest of the night staring at the security monitors, jumping at every flicker, every shadow. He quit the following morning, handing in his resignation with a trembling hand, not even bothering to give 2 weeks' notice. He found a new job within days, daytime security at a local bank. Better hours, better pay, and most importantly, no abandoned, echoing sections to patrol. The demolition crew began their work on the West Wing on schedule. Bill, driving past the mall during the day, would occasionally slow down, watching the giant machines tear into the structure, ripping away walls and exposing the skeletal remains of the forgotten stores. He felt a strange mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity. He never went back at night. He never wanted to risk hearing that laughter again, echoing through the empty spaces. He never wanted to know what truly lurked behind that security gate, what had stretched the plastic sheeting into that impossible, nightmarish face. Sometimes, though, when he was alone in the quiet darkness of his apartment, he would hear it, that high-pitched, sharp laugh, so vivid in his memory, so real. And he would wonder, if he had stayed just a few seconds longer, just a few feet closer, would he have seen what was pressing through that plastic? Would he have learned why it knew his name? Those nights, sleep evaded him. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside, his mind replaying the events of that terrifying night over and over again. He made sure to lock all his windows now. One persistent, nagging detail bothered him more than the laughter, more than the impossible shape in the plastic, more than hearing his name whispered by that unearthly voice. It was a detail he hadn't noticed until the next morning, when, in a moment of morbid curiosity or perhaps a subconscious need for closure, he had walked past the West Wing one last time before submitting his resignation. The morning sunlight, stark and unforgiving, revealed everything the darkness had hidden. The security gate was intact, the black plastic sheeting undisturbed, seemingly untouched. Everything appeared normal, ordinary, almost mundane. But then he saw it. There, on the heavy steel links of the gate, were 5 distinct marks, long, deep scratches spaced evenly apart, like the imprint of gigantic fingers. The metal in those grooves was corroded, eaten away, as if by some powerful acid. And next to those marks, etched into the steel with the same corrosive substance, was a single word: "Goodbye, Willie." The use of his childhood nickname, a name only his family and closest friends ever used, sent a fresh wave of icy terror through him. He backed away slowly, his gaze fixed on the chilling message, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He walked out of the Starlight Galleria that morning and never looked back. He tried to put the experience behind him, to bury it beneath the routines of his new job, the normalcy of daylight hours. But the memory, like a persistent infection, festered beneath the surface. Sometimes, when he passed by darkened storefronts at night, he would quicken his pace, his heart rate accelerating involuntarily. He would find himself avoiding malls altogether, opting for online shopping or small, open-air markets. And he absolutely, positively, never stopped when he heard laughter coming from behind locked doors. They tore down the West Wing the following year, replacing it with a multi-level parking structure. Bill, driving past the site, noticed that the construction had taken longer than expected, plagued by unexplained delays and equipment malfunctions. He heard rumors from former colleagues that the demolition crew had complained of strange sounds, unsettling shadows, and tools disappearing overnight. He didn't inquire further. He refused to park in the new structure, refused to even drive past it after dark. Because sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, people reported hearing laughter echoing from the concrete depths of the parking garage, high-pitched, sharp laughter that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. And sometimes, they said, if you listened very carefully, you could hear it calling names. Names of people it remembered, names of people it was waiting for. Bill changed jobs again several months later, moving to a different city, a fresh start, a place where nobody knew his name, his past, his encounter in the abandoned West Wing. He hoped distance and anonymity would provide some measure of peace, some escape from the haunting memories. But the memories, like the laughter, proved more persistent than he could have imagined. He still checked the locks twice before going to bed, a compulsive ritual born of that night in the mall. He still slept with a night light on, a childish habit he couldn't shake, the darkness behind his closed eyelids still filled with the image of that stretching, distorting plastic. And he still woke up in a cold sweat whenever he heard laughter in his dreams, that high-pitched, sharp laughter, always followed by the whisper of his name, Willie, spoken with a wet, guttural intonation that chilled him to the bone. Because Bill Foster knew something now that he hadn't known before that terrifying encounter. Something that fundamentally altered the way he perceived the world, the way he understood the boundary between the seen and the unseen. He knew that not all empty spaces were truly empty. Not all locked doors remained securely locked. And sometimes the things that laughed in the dark knew your name. They knew your name, and they possessed a patience that stretched beyond human comprehension. He started writing it all down, partly as a form of therapy, partly as a warning to others. He filled notebooks with his account of that night, scribbling furiously, trying to capture every detail, every sensation, every chilling sound. He wrote about the laughter, the footsteps, the impossible shape in the plastic, the corrosive marks on the gate, the whisper of his name. He wrote about the feeling of being followed, of being watched, even in his new city, in his new life. He described the sensation of cold fingers brushing against the back of his neck when he walked alone at night, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps behind him, always just out of reach, always getting closer. The doctors, when he finally sought professional help, diagnosed him with generalized anxiety disorder with a touch of post-traumatic stress. They prescribed medication, suggested therapy, but they hadn't seen the marks on the gate. They hadn't heard their names whispered in the darkness by a voice that belonged to something inhuman. Bill moved again and again and again. Each new city offered a temporary respite, a brief illusion of safety, but it never lasted. The laughter, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, they always caught up. He became a nomad, a fugitive from a fear he couldn't articulate, a terror he couldn't escape. He knew, with a growing certainty that bordered on despair, that it wouldn't matter how far he ran, how many cities he fled to, how many fresh starts he attempted. Because somewhere out there, in an empty mall, a dark storefront, a lonely parking structure, or perhaps even closer, something was laughing. And it was waiting for someone else to hear it, someone else to investigate, someone else to shine their light into the darkness, someone whose name it could learn. He reminded himself, with increasing desperation, to remember his story, to remember the warning, because once it knew your name, you could never truly stop running. And sooner or later, everyone gets tired of running. The fatigue was settling in, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could alleviate. He found himself staring out windows, lost in thought, replaying the events of that night over and over, searching for clues, for explanations, for anything that could make sense of the senseless. He started avoiding mirrors, catching glimpses of his own reflection and seeing, for a fleeting second, the distorted, stretched features of the thing in the plastic. He stopped answering his phone, convinced that the next call would be it, somehow using technology to reach him, to taunt him, to remind him that it was still out there. He could hear it now, as he sat hunched over his latest, nearly empty apartment, or the familiar, high-pitched laugh echoing faintly, as if coming from a great distance, yet simultaneously right outside his door. The sound seemed to vibrate in his very bones, a chilling resonance that bypassed his ears and went straight to his soul. Those heavy, deliberate footsteps, too, were back. He could hear them pacing slowly in the hallway outside his apartment, a rhythmic thudding that matched the frantic beat of his heart. Thud, 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 closer, always closer. It was time to run again. He knew it, but the thought of packing, of moving, of starting over yet again, filled him with a profound sense of exhaustion. He was so tired, so incredibly tired of running. The laughter grew louder, closer, now seemingly coming from just behind his bedroom door. The footsteps stopped. A long, drawn-out silence descended, more terrifying than any sound. Then a soft, wet tap, tap, tap on the door, like fingers, long, thin, cold fingers. A whisper, barely audible, yet penetrating every corner of the room. Willie, the final account, a jumble of hastily scrawled words and incomplete sentences, was discovered on a laptop in a sparsely furnished apartment in Seattle. The tenant, William Foster, a former security guard with a history of short-term employment and frequent relocations, had been reported missing by his landlord. His current whereabouts were unknown. The laptop was open, the screen displaying the unfinished document, the cursor blinking mockingly after the last. Desperate sentence. So tired. The uninvited guest. This happened when I was a teenager. My younger sibling, Ethan, who was 5 years my junior, frequently sought refuge in my room at night. He was a sweet kid, and his fear of sleeping alone was something I understood, though the specific reason remained a mystery. Our parents, a bit exasperated, attributed it to an overactive imagination fueled by late-night monster movies and the occasional nightmare. One particular evening, Ethan, with his usual pleading eyes, asked to bunk with me. However, my parents had laid down the law that night. Ethan needed to learn to sleep in his own bed. They warned me that harboring him would result in consequences for both of us. I was a stickler for not getting on their bad side. The fear of their disapproval outweighed my sympathy for my little brother. With a heavy heart, I explained the situation to Ethan. "I'm really sorry, buddy, but Mom and Dad were serious this time. You have to try to be brave." He begged, he pleaded, his lower lip trembling, promising he'd be quiet as a mouse. But I stood firm, a knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. Eventually, his pleas faded into a defeated sigh, and he trudged back to his own room. His small shoulders slumped. To ensure there would be no midnight sneak-ins, I made sure my door was not just shut, but locked. The click of the bolt echoed in the quiet hallway, a sound that felt unusually loud, unusually final. I slipped into bed, the weight of my decision heavy on me. Later, deep in the slumber of the night, a faint rattling sound reached my ears. The doorknob was turning back and forth, persistent, hesitant jiggle. I listened, my heart rate picking up. The rattling stopped, followed by a soft click, and what a chilling click it was. The sound of my lock, a simple bedroom lock that Ethan and I had both mastered picking with bobby pins during our childhood games, being undone. The door creaked open, the faint light from the hallway spilling into my room. I turned, expecting to see Ethan's sheepish face. Instead, I saw a dark silhouette, low to the ground, crawling slowly, deliberately into my room. A wave of annoyance washed over me, quickly followed by resignation. "Ethan," I sighed, "fine, you win. Just get in here. But if Mom finds out, we're both in deep trouble." The figure continued to crawl, its movements strangely fluid, almost unsettling. I expected to feel the familiar weight of my brother clambering onto the bed, the rustle of his pajamas, the small, comforting presence of him. But there was nothing, just the open door and this thing crawling on the floor. A minute ticked by, an eternity in the silent room. I craned my neck, peering towards the still open doorway. All I could see was the inky blackness of the hallway beyond. A shiver of unease ran down my spine. "Ethan," I called out, my voice a little shaky. Silence. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet padding softly on the carpet. I crept down the hallway towards Ethan's room, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed open his door, and there he was, sound asleep in his bed, his small form curled up under the covers. The breath caught in my throat. If Ethan was here, then who or what was in my room? I didn't sleep in my own bed that night. The chilling mystery of the crawling figure remained, a haunting question mark etched into the memory of that night. The shadow on the sidewalk. This incident occurred about 5 years ago, when I was 17, a time when youthful confidence often overshadowed caution. It's a story I've recounted many times, not for boastful reasons, but because the sheer, inexplicable terror of it still resonates with me. It's a stark reminder of how quickly the mundane can morph into the menacing. I held a part-time job at the local Walmart, a sprawling superstore just a mile from my modest home. The walk was usually uneventful, a familiar trek I undertook without a second thought. I didn't own a car, and my parents, trusting my independence, saw no issue with my pedestrian commute. Besides, I genuinely didn't mind the exercise. My shifts were a mixed bag, but the most frequent one was the 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. slot. This meant my walk to work occurred during the daylight hours, a pleasant stroll under the afternoon sun. However, My return journey was always shrouded in darkness, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. On this particular evening, work was utterly ordinary. Nothing out of the usual retail routine, stocking shelves, assisting customers, the humdrum rhythm of a teenage job. As my shift ended, I clocked out and began my usual walk home. Stepping out of the brightly lit store into the cool night air, I traversed the vast parking lot towards the street. At the bus stop adjacent to the Walmart, I noticed a man sitting alone. He wasn't particularly remarkable, just a nondescript figure waiting, seemingly, for a bus. I didn't give him a second thought, merely registering his presence as I crossed the street and started down the long, dimly lit road that led to my neighborhood. The street lights along this stretch were notoriously unreliable, casting a weak, flickering glow that barely pierced the darkness. A few minutes into my walk, a flicker of awareness prompted me to glance over my shoulder. The man from the bus stop was now walking behind me, perhaps 100 yards back. He appeared to be engaged in a phone conversation, his head tilted down towards his device. A small seed of unease began to sprout within me. It was odd, undeniably, that this man had been waiting at a bus stop, yet was now walking in the same direction as me, on a street that offered little in the way of destinations besides residential homes. I subtly increased my pace, trying to dismiss the feeling as paranoia. After all, it was a public street, and he had every right to be there. A few more minutes passed, my thoughts drifting to other things: homework, friends, the trivial concerns of a teenager. Then, the memory of the man resurfaced, and I glanced back again. This time, the sight that met my eyes sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through me. The man was now shockingly close, a mere 2 or 3 yards behind me, and he was walking backward. His movements were eerily silent, a ghostly glide that had allowed him to close the distance without me hearing a single footstep. I froze, my mind struggling to process the absurdity of the situation. He was facing away from me, his features obscured by the darkness. For a fleeting, insane moment, I almost laughed, thinking it was some kind of bizarre prank, a twisted joke orchestrated by someone I knew. But a deep, primal instinct, a cold, hard knot of fear in my gut, told me otherwise. The realization of my isolation hit me with full force. There were no other pedestrians, no cars passing by. I was utterly alone on this dark, desolate street with a man who was behaving in a manner that defied all logic and reason. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by fear. Instead, I turned and bolted. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound of my own frantic footsteps was quickly joined by another, the rhythmic smack of shoes against the pavement, gaining on me. I risked another glance over my shoulder, and the sight that met my eyes was even more horrifying than before. The man was now running, keeping pace with me, his body no longer facing backward. He was a relentless pursuer, closing the distance with alarming speed. I didn't look long enough to see his face, but the image of him sprinting after me, his intentions utterly unknown, was seared into my memory. Within minutes, fueled by adrenaline and terror, I reached my house. The front door, blessedly, was unlocked. I burst through it, slamming it shut behind me and frantically engaging the lock. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling uncontrollably. I peered through the peephole, my heart pounding in my ears. The man was gone. My parents were still awake, their faces etched with concern as I stammered out my story, my voice choked with tears and near hysteria. My father, a man of action, immediately went outside, armed with a flashlight, to search the perimeter of our house. He returned empty-handed, reporting that he saw no sign of the man. We checked every window, every door, scanning the darkness for any sign of our pursuer. But he had vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread and a multitude of unanswered questions. Sleep was a distant prospect that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent shivers of fear down my spine. I imagined the man breaking in, shattering a window, standing over my bed. But the night passed without further incident, and morning eventually arrived, bringing with it a fragile sense of relief. From that day forward, my mother insisted on driving me to and from work. Every time we drove past that bus stop, past that long, desolate street, I scanned the surroundings, searching for the man. But I never saw him again. He remained a phantom, a terrifying enigma, a stark reminder of the vulnerability that can lurk in the shadows of the ordinary. The residue of Ravenwood Heights, the first clue, the subtle signal that something was profoundly amiss at Ravenwood Heights, wasn't the eerie silence or the unfinished state of the luxury apartment complex. It was the single, crumpled candy wrapper Amy Blackwood found tucked into a corner of Unit 4B on the 5th floor. Amy, a seasoned security professional with over 12 years of experience on various sites, from bustling shopping centers to sprawling industrial parks, prided herself on her observational skills. Ravenwood Heights, a high-end residential project nearing completion, was supposed to be an easy assignment, a final, quiet gig before she transitioned to a desk job. Walk the floors, check the doors, deter any would-be vandals or thrill-seeking teenagers. Simple, but that candy wrapper, it bothered her. It was a Choco Blast wrapper, its metallic surface catching the beam of her powerful flashlight. The construction crews had finished work on that section of the 5th floor over a week ago. A thorough cleaning crew had swept through on Friday, leaving the unit spotless, pristine, ready for final inspection. Amy herself had patrolled the floor on Sunday night. The wrapper hadn't been there. She was certain of it. She picked it up, her gloved fingers carefully avoiding smudging any potential fingerprints. The expiration date printed on the back was still months away. This wasn't old trash. It was recent. Amy made a meticulous note in her logbook, her pen scratching against the paper in the otherwise silent building. Tuesday, 11:47 p.m. Unit 4B, 5th floor. Discovered single Choco Blast wrapper in corner. No apparent forced entry. Possible contractor after-hours activity? She continued her rounds, her senses heightened, her mind already working through the possibilities. Could be something insignificant. A construction worker sneaking a snack. The wind somehow blowing it in through a microscopic gap in a windowsill. But a nagging unease, a prickling at the back of her neck, told her otherwise. The building was eerily quiet. Even for a construction site after hours, the silence was unsettling. No hum of distant machinery, no rattle of tarps in the wind, just the faint, almost imperceptible hum of temporary lighting. The air felt heavy, stagnant, with a faint, almost metallic scent she couldn't quite place. It reminded her of something. Old copper pennies, perhaps? She returned to the security office, a small, windowless room on the ground floor, and reviewed the security camera footage from the past 24 hours. Nothing. No one had entered or exited Unit 4B except for the cleaning crew on Friday. The cameras covering the hallways and exterior entrances showed only the occasional security patrol herself. Amy frowned, tapping her pen against the logbook. Something wasn't right. Her instincts, honed over years of experience, were screaming at her. She decided to alter her patrol schedule for the following night, prioritizing the 5th floor. She would find out what was going on in Unit 4B. She always did. Wednesday night felt different from the moment Amy arrived. The air was heavier, charged with a strange static electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She checked in with the departing day shift supervisor, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Frank Miller. "Anything unusual to report, Frank?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Frank just shrugged, his eyes scanning the rows of security monitors. "Nah, just the usual. Bunch of wind rattling some tarps on the south side. Nothing you can't handle, Blackwood." Amy nodded, but she wasn't convinced. The silence of the building seemed to press in on her, a suffocating weight. She made her way to the 5th floor, deliberately altering her usual route. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator, listening intently for any sound out of place. The stairwell was dimly lit, the concrete steps cold under her boots. Each footfall echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Reaching the 5th floor, she paused outside Unit 4B. The door was locked, the tamper-evident seal she had placed on it the previous night intact. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Nothing. She completed her 10 p.m. rounds, checking every room in 4B, shining her flashlight into every corner, under every piece of plastic sheeting covering the new fixtures and appliances. The unit was pristine, empty, exactly as it should be. She repeated the process at midnight. Still nothing. The air felt colder in 4B, though, a noticeable drop in temperature compared to the hallway. Amy shivered, despite her heavy jacket. It was at 3 a.m. that she found them. Returning to 4B for her hourly check, she immediately sensed a change. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a distinct odor, a combination of stale sweat and something else, something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. On the floor, near the kitchen counter, lay 2 more Choco Blast wrappers and an empty bag of spicy nacho chips. This time, they were positioned under the plastic sheeting covering the brand new countertop. Someone had deliberately moved the plastic, placed the trash underneath, and then redraped the sheeting, attempting to conceal their presence. Amy's pulse quickened. This wasn't a careless worker leaving behind their lunch. This was something else. Someone was deliberately taunting her. She carefully photographed the scene with her phone, making sure to capture the position of the wrappers and the disturbed plastic. Then she called her supervisor, Frank. "Frank, it's Blackwood. We've got activity in 4B again." His voice, gruff and annoyed, crackled through the phone. "What is it this time, Blackwood?" "Another candy wrapper." "2 wrappers," Amy corrected, her voice tight, "and an empty chip bag." They were hidden under the plastic sheeting on the countertop. Someone's been in there, moving things around. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Frank sighed. All right, I'll call the site manager. See if anyone was authorized to be up there. But I'm telling you, Blackwood, it's probably just some worker leaving their trash. Write it up, and I'll deal with it in the morning." "But, Frank, just write it up, Blackwood." The line went dead. Amy clenched her fists, frustration burning in her chest. She knew it wasn't just a worker. Workers wouldn't sneak into an unfinished, locked apartment to eat snacks, and they certainly wouldn't hide their trash. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Amy began a meticulous search of Unit 4B, far more thorough than her previous checks. She moved every piece of plastic sheeting, checked every closet, peered behind every stack of drywall and boxes of tiles. The apartment was undeniably empty, but the evidence of recent activity was undeniable. She found faint scuff marks on the newly polished concrete floor that hadn't been there before, even after the cleaning crew had finished. She noticed finger smudges on the inside of a window, high up, near the ceiling, where no worker would have had reason to touch. And in the master bathroom, she found a single, dark hair clinging to the edge of the brand new, still wrapped bathtub. It was long, coarse, and definitely not hers. Amy carefully collected the hair, placing it in a small evidence bag she carried in her kit. She photographed the scuff marks and the fingerprints, documenting everything with meticulous precision. She decided to change her tactics. Instead of simply patrolling the floor, she would spend the rest of her shift stationed in the hallway outside Unit 4B, listening, watching, waiting. The building remained eerily silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the temporary lighting and the occasional creak of the building settling. Amy stood motionless in the dimly lit hallway, her senses on high alert. She had turned off her flashlight to avoid casting any shadows that might alert whoever was inside 4B. Hours passed. Nothing. Just as she was starting to doubt her instincts, to wonder if Frank was right, if it was just a careless worker, she heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from inside Unit 4B. It was barely audible, but Amy's trained ears picked it up immediately. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. Then silence. Amy waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She counted to 60 slowly, deliberately. Then she heard it again. A soft thud, followed by another scraping sound, closer this time. It was definitely coming from inside the apartment. She reached for her radio, her hand trembling slightly. This time, she wouldn't hesitate. She wouldn't call Frank. She would call the police directly. But before she could key the microphone, the door to Unit 4B slowly creaked open. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway, the faint light from the emergency exit sign barely penetrating the inky blackness within the apartment. Amy held her breath, her hand tightening around the grip of her heavy-duty flashlight. She hadn't unlocked the door. She knew she hadn't. The scraping sound started again, closer now, accompanied by a soft, wet shuffling. It sounded like something heavy and damp being dragged across the floor. Amy raised her flashlight, her thumb hovering over the switch. She had to see what was inside. She had to know. Taking a deep breath, she flicked on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of Unit 4B. First, she saw nothing. Just the empty living room, the plastic-covered furniture, the stacks of building materials. Then, her light caught something on the floor, near the kitchen counter. It was a shirt, a cheap, blue polyester shirt, stained dark under the arms, crumpled in a heap on the floor. It was still damp with sweat. Amy's heart leaped into her throat. This wasn't just trash. This was evidence. Someone had been in the apartment recently, very recently. She took a cautious step inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room, searching every corner, every shadow. The air felt heavy, thick with that strange, sweet and sour odor she had noticed before. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Security. Is anyone in here?" No response. She moved further into the apartment, clearing each room methodically, her senses on high alert. The kitchen, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, all empty. But the signs of recent occupancy were undeniable. In the master bedroom, she found an empty water bottle rolling across the floor. In the closet, a granola bar wrapper stuffed into a corner. And in the bathroom, on the floor next to the toilet, a wadded-up paper towel, stained with fresh blood. The blood, that was the tipping point. Amy immediately backed out of the apartment, her mind racing. She called the police, her voice shaking slightly as she reported the situation. "This is Security Officer Blackwood at Ravenwood Heights construction site. I have a possible break-in, Unit 4B, 5th floor. Evidence of someone being injured. I need officers dispatched immediately." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Units are en route, ma'am. ETA 5 minutes. Stay where you are. Do not engage." Amy waited outside the apartment, her flashlight trained on the open doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the distant sirens approaching. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. 2 uniformed officers arrived, their expressions grim. Amy quickly briefed them on the situation, showing them the evidence she had collected: the candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the empty water bottle, the granola bar wrapper, and the blood-stained paper towel. The officers, Sergeant Miller and Officer Davies, took the situation seriously. They drew their weapons and entered Unit 4B, clearing each room methodically, their movements precise and coordinated. Amy stayed close behind, her flashlight illuminating their path. The apartment was empty. No sign of forced entry, Sergeant Miller noted, his brow furrowed. "The door was unlocked when we arrived." "You're sure you secured it?" "Positive, Sergeant," Amy replied, her voice firm. "I checked it myself multiple times during my rounds, and I put a tamper evidence seal on it last night. It was intact when I returned at 2 a.m. Officer Davies pointed to the scuff marks on the floor, the finger smudges on the window, the pulled-back carpet padding. "Looks like someone's been spending some time in here. Maybe a squatter." "Possibly," Miller conceded. "But why for B? The whole building's empty. They could have picked any unit." They continued their search, examining every detail, every clue. They found more subtle signs: a faint indentation on the plastic-covered sofa, as if someone had been sitting there. A single, muddy footprint near the balcony door. A faint, almost imperceptible trail of dried blood leading from the bathroom to the bedroom closet. The closet. That's where it felt wrong. Amy pointed her flashlight into the darkness of the closet. The beam caught something glinting on the floor, a small, metallic object. Sergeant Miller knelt down and carefully picked it up. It was a key, a single, ordinary-looking key with a small plastic tag attached. The tag had a number on it, 4B. Amy's blood ran cold. It was the key to the apartment. The key that was supposed to be hanging on her belt loop, along with the master key set. "Where did you find this, officer?" Miller asked, his voice sharp. "Inside the closet," Amy replied, her voice barely a whisper. "On the floor." Miller turned to her, his eyes narrowed. "You said you had the key to this unit." "I do," Amy insisted, reaching for her belt loop. Her fingers fumbled, searching for the familiar weight of the key ring. It wasn't there. Her heart sank. The master key set, along with the key to Unit 4B, was gone. Panic tightened its grip around Amy's chest. She frantically searched her pockets, her security bag, even retraced her steps back to the hallway, but the keys were nowhere to be found. Had she dropped them? Had someone taken them? Sergeant Miller's expression hardened. "Officer Blackwood, are you telling me you lost the master key set to this entire building?" Amy swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know how it happened, Sergeant. I had them when I started my shift. I checked them constantly." Officer Davies, who had been examining the lock on the apartment door, spoke up. "Sergeant, there's no sign of forced entry. This lock hasn't been picked or tampered with. Whoever was in here had a key." The implication was clear. Amy, the security officer, was now the prime suspect. "Officer Blackwood," Miller said, his voice low and serious, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station with us. We need to get your statement." Amy's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. She was the one who reported the break-in. She was the one who found the evidence. She was the victim here, not the perpetrator. But the evidence, the missing keys, the unlocked door, the signs of someone living in the apartment, it all pointed to her. Or at least it created enough reasonable doubt to warrant an investigation. As she followed the officers out of the building, her head hung low. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Something far more sinister than a simple break-in or a case of misplaced keys. The eerie silence of the building, the strange, sweet and sour odor, the feeling of being watched, it all added up to something wrong. She glanced back at Unit 4B, the open doorway a black rectangle in the dimly lit hallway. For a split second, she thought she saw something move in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of something tall and dark, just at the edge of her vision. But when she blinked, it was gone. The police questioned her for hours. They asked about her work history, her personal life, any possible enemies she might have. They asked about the missing keys, about her movements that night, about her knowledge of the building's security systems. Amy answered their questions truthfully, to the best of her ability, but she could sense their skepticism. They didn't believe her. They thought she was involved somehow. They released her pending further investigation, but the damage was done. Her reputation was tarnished. Her job was on the line. And the unsettling feeling that something else was happening at Ravenwood Heights continued to gnaw at her. She knew she had to clear her name. She had to find out what was really going on in Unit 4B. And she had to do it alone. Amy decided to conduct her own investigation, working independently and discreetly. She couldn't access the building's security footage without authorization, but she still had her logbook, her photos, and her memory. She started by reviewing everything she had documented. The candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the water bottle, the granola bar wrapper, the blood-stained paper towel, the scuff marks, the fingerprints, the hair, the muddy footprint, the missing keys, and the key found in the closet. The key. That was the most troubling piece of evidence. How did it end up inside the closet if she hadn't put it there? And how had her master key set disappeared? She went back to the motel where she was staying and meticulously retraced all the steps on her way to the complex and on her rounds.
No keys.
She decided to focus on the timeline. She knew she had the keys at the start of her shift. She remembered checking them, as she always did, before leaving the security office. She remembered unlocking the stairwell door to access the 5th floor. So, the keys must have disappeared sometime between her arrival on the 5th floor and her discovery of the blood-stained paper towel in Unit 4B. That narrowed it down, but not by much. It still encompassed several hours and multiple rooms. She decided to focus on Unit 4B itself. There had to be something she had missed, some clue that would explain what was happening. She couldn't officially access the building, but she knew a back entrance that was often left unlocked by the construction crews. It was a risk, but she was desperate. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Amy slipped back into Ravenwood Heights. The building felt different this time. The silence was deeper, more oppressive, punctuated by the faint creaks and groans of the unfinished structure. Amy moved slowly, deliberately, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She headed straight for the 5th floor, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, her senses on high alert. Reaching Unit 4B, she paused. The door was now sealed with police tape, a stark yellow banner across the entrance. Crime scene, do not enter. Amy hesitated. She knew she was breaking the law, trespassing on a potential crime scene. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed were inside that apartment. Carefully, she peeled back a corner of the tape, enough to slip through without breaking the seal completely. She would reseal it when she left, leaving no trace of her presence. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she had left it. The plastic sheeting still covered the furniture and appliances. The scuff marks were still visible on the floor. The faint odor of sweat and something else, something almost metallic, still hung in the air. She started her search in the bathroom, where she had found the blood-stained paper towel. She examined the sink, the toilet, the bathtub, looking for any trace of blood that the police might have missed. Nothing. Then, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint discoloration on the wall, just above the baseboard. It was subtle, almost invisible, but in the beam of her flashlight, it was clear. A dark, reddish-brown stain, shaped like a handprint. Amy's heart quickened. This was new. The police hadn't documented this. She carefully photographed the handprint, then continued her search. She moved into the master bedroom, where she had found the empty water bottle and the granola bar wrapper. She checked the closet, the same closet where the police had found the key to the apartment. She ran her hand along the back wall, feeling for any irregularities, any hidden seams or openings. Nothing. Then, she noticed something on the floor, in the corner of the closet. A small, almost imperceptible gap between the baseboard and the wall. It was barely wide enough to insert a finger, but it was there. Amy knelt down, her flashlight beam focused on the gap. She could see something inside, something dark and reflective. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thin metal probe she carried in her security kit. Carefully, she inserted the probe into the gap and hooked the object, slowly pulling it out. It was a small, silver compact mirror, the kind women carry in their purses. It was old, tarnished, and covered in a layer of dust. Amy opened the compact. The mirror inside was cracked, but she could still make out her reflection, distorted and fragmented. And then, she saw something else. Behind her reflection, in the cracked glass, a fleeting glimpse of a face. A woman's face, pale and gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes. Amy gasped, dropping the compact, clattered on the floor, the sound echoing loudly in the silent apartment. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. Nothing. She was alone, but she knew what she had seen, and she knew, with a growing certainty, that the answers she was looking for were not just in Unit 4B, but somehow connected to it, hidden within its walls, its floors, its very foundation. The missing keys, the strange occurrences, the face in the mirror, it all pointed to something far more complex, far more sinister than a simple break-in. Amy picked up the compact mirror again, her hands trembling. She examined it closely, turning it over in her hands. The silver was tarnished, but she could make out a faint inscription on the back. MD 1894. The same initials and date as the Marlene Davies pickup. Her blood ran cold. She closed the compact and slipped it into her pocket. She needed to get out of the apartment, out of the building. She needed to think, to process what she had just seen. As she was carefully resealing the police tape on the door, she heard it again. That faint scraping sound coming from inside the apartment. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, her flashlight beam trained on the door. The scraping sound stopped. Then, a soft, whispery voice, barely audible, seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. "Help me." Amy didn't hesitate. She ran. She fled the building, not stopping until she was several blocks away, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't look back. She spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. The face in the mirror, the voice in the walls, the initials on the compact, it all pointed to something connected to the history of the building, to something that had happened long ago. She decided to do some research. She pulled out her laptop and started searching online for information about Ravenwood Heights, about the history of the site, about any previous buildings that had stood there. She found something surprising. Ravenwood Heights was built on the site of an old Victorian mansion that had burned down in 1895. The mansion had belonged to a wealthy businessman named Arthur Blackwood, no relation, and his young wife, Marlene Davies Blackwood, had disappeared the night of the fire. Her body was never found. Amy stared at the screen, her mind racing. The initials on the compact, the date, the fire, the missing woman, it all connected. She dug deeper, searching for old newspaper articles, historical records, anything she could find about Marlene Davies Blackwood. She found a grainy photograph of Marlene, taken shortly before her disappearance. She was a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and striking eyes, and around her neck, she wore a delicate silver necklace with a small, round pendant that looked exactly like the compact mirror Amy had found. Amy felt a chill run down her spine. She was on to something, something big, something that went far beyond a simple break-in or a case of misplaced keys. She knew she had to go back to Ravenwood Heights. She had to find out what really happened to Marlene Davies Blackwood. And she had to find out what was hiding in the walls of Unit 4B. The next day, Amy went to the local historical society, posing as a researcher interested in the history of Ravenwood Heights. She spent hours poring over old maps, building plans, and newspaper archives. She discovered that the original Blackwood mansion had been much larger than the current apartment complex, extending further back from the street. The area where Unit 4B was now located had been part of the mansion's original foundation, specifically the basement and servants' quarters. She also found more details about the fire. It had been ruled accidental, caused by a faulty gas lamp, but rumors persisted that Arthur Blackwood had deliberately set the fire to collect insurance money and get rid of his wife, with whom he was rumored to be having marital problems. Amy found a detailed floor plan of the original mansion. She carefully compared it to the blueprints of Ravenwood Heights, overlaying them in her mind. A chill ran down her spine. Unit 4B was built directly over the location of the mansion's old coal cellar. And according to the floor plan, there was a small, hidden room adjacent to the coal cellar, marked only as storage. It had no windows, no doors leading to the outside, and only one narrow passage connecting it to the rest of the basement. A secret room. Amy knew with a growing certainty that she had found the key to the mystery. Something was hidden in that secret room, something connected to Marlene Davies Blackwood's disappearance. And somehow that something was reaching out, manifesting in Unit 4B, leaving behind traces of its presence, the candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the blood, the footprints, the missing keys, and the voice. She had to get back into Ravenwood Heights. She had to find that secret room. This time, she wouldn't go alone. She contacted a former colleague, a private investigator named Jack Reynolds, who had experience with cold cases and unusual situations. She explained everything, showing him her photos, her notes, the newspaper clippings, and the silver compact. Jack, initially skeptical, listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious as Amy laid out her evidence. He agreed to help. They planned their return to Ravenwood Heights for the following night. They would go in prepared, armed with tools, cameras, and a healthy dose of caution. They would find that secret room, and they would uncover the truth, whatever it may be. The residue was becoming clearer. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Amy and Jack returned to Ravenwood Heights. They bypassed the main entrance, opting for the same back route Amy had used before. The building loomed before them, a dark, silent monolith against the night sky. Jack, a tall, muscular man with a military bearing, carried a heavy-duty duffel bag containing their equipment. Crowbars, flashlights, cameras, a digital voice recorder, and a small, handheld thermal scanner. Amy carried her own flashlight and a taser, a precaution she hoped she wouldn't need. They slipped inside the building, the silence amplifying the sound of their footsteps. The air felt heavy, thick with that same metallic scent Amy had noticed before. It was stronger now, almost overpowering. They made their way to the 5th floor, their movements slow and deliberate. The hallway outside Unit 4B was eerily quiet. The police tape was still in place, a stark reminder of the official investigation. Jack carefully peeled back the tape, and they entered the apartment. The air inside 4B was noticeably colder than the hallway. Amy shivered, despite her jacket. The faint odor of sweat and decay was more pronounced here, mixed with the metallic tang. "Let's start in the bathroom," Amy said, her voice low. "That's where I found the handprint, and where I heard the voices." Jack nodded, his hand resting on the crowbar slung over his shoulder. They moved into the bathroom, their flashlights sweeping across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The handprint was still there, faintly visible on the wall above the baseboard. Jack examined the wall carefully, running his gloved hand along the surface. He tapped on the wall in several places, listening for any change in sound. "Hollow," he muttered. "There's something behind here." He pulled out a small, handheld thermal scanner and pointed it at the wall. The screen displayed a heat signature, a large, rectangular area that was significantly colder than the surrounding wall. "That's it," Amy whispered. "That's where the secret room is." Jack nodded, his eyes grim. "Let's get this wall open." They worked quickly and efficiently, using the crowbars to pry off the drywall and expose the underlying structure. The old plaster and lath crumbled easily, revealing a narrow opening behind. Dust and debris filled the air, making them cough. Amy shone her flashlight into the opening. It was the same narrow space she had found before, leading to the hidden door. "I'll go first," Jack said, his voice low. "You cover me." He squeezed through the opening, his broad shoulders barely fitting. Amy followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the hidden passage was thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was colder here, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their clothes. They reached the hidden door. Jack examined it carefully, running his hand along the edges. He found a small, almost invisible latch concealed within the molding. He pressed the latch. The door clicked open, swinging inward with a groan of rusty hinges. Beyond the door lay the secret room. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small, square space. The walls were bare brick, the floor concrete. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, and on the chair sat a skeleton. It was dressed in the tattered remains of a once elegant gown, the fabric faded and torn. A few strands of long, dark hair still clung to the skull. Around the skeleton's neck, a delicate silver chain glinted in the flashlight beam. Attached to the chain was a small, round compact mirror. Amy gasped. It was Marlene Davies Blackwood. Jack slowly approached the skeleton, his expression grim. He examined the remains carefully, his trained eye searching for any clues. "No obvious signs of trauma," he muttered.
No broken bones, no bullet holes.
"But look at this." He pointed to the skeleton's hands. They were clenched tightly, The bony fingers wrapped around something small and metallic. Amy moved closer, her flashlight beam focused on the skeleton's hands. Nestled within the clenched fingers was a key, a single, ordinary-looking key with a small plastic tag attached. The tag had a number on it, 4B, the missing key, the key to the apartment. A wave of dizziness washed over Amy. She felt like she was going to faint. The air in the room grew colder. The metallic scent intensified, and then they heard it, a soft, whispery voice, seemingly coming from the skeleton itself. "He trapped me." The whisper echoed in the small, confined space, sending a shiver down Amy's spine. Jack, despite his hardened demeanor, visibly flinched. "He promised," he lied. The voice continued, gaining strength, becoming more distinct, more human. Amy raised her flashlight, shining it directly on the skeleton. The light seemed to refract strangely off the bones, creating flickering shadows on the walls. The walls? "He sealed me in." Jack pulled out his digital voice recorder and switched it on. "Can you tell us who did this?" he asked, his voice surprisingly steady. A long silence. Then, a name, whispered with a chilling mix of sorrow and rage. "Arthur." Amy's blood ran cold. Arthur Blackwood, Marlene's husband, the man who had supposedly been out of town the night of the fire, the man who had inherited her fortune. He wanted the money, the jewels. The voice continued, growing fainter. "He left me to die." The temperature in the room plummeted. Amy could see her breath forming white clouds in the air. The metallic scent became overwhelming, making her eyes water. Suddenly, the skeleton's jaw began to move, clicking and grinding as if trying to form words. The silver compact mirror around its neck began to glow with a faint, bluish-white light. Jack took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the taser in his holster. "He's still here," the voice whispered, now barely audible. "He never left." Then the room went dark. The flashlights died. The voice ceased. The only sound was the frantic beating of their hearts. Amy fumbled for her backup flashlight, her hands shaking. She switched it on, its weak beam barely penetrating the darkness. Jack was gone. "Jack?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She swept the flashlight around the room, searching desperately. The skeleton was still there, slumped in the chair, the compact mirror now dull and lifeless. But Jack was nowhere to be seen. Then she heard it, a scraping sound coming from behind the brick wall, the same wall where the hidden door had been. The door was gone. The wall was solid brick again. Amy screamed. She pounded on the wall, her fists raw and bleeding, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped in the secret room with the remains of Marlene Davies Blackwood. And she was not alone. She could hear breathing now, coming from the corner of the room. Slow, deliberate breathing, and a faint, almost imperceptible chuckle. A voice, cold and cruel, whispered in her ear. "Welcome home, Amelia." The voice, undeniably masculine and laced with a chilling amusement, sent a wave of pure terror through Amy. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting frantically across the small, enclosed space. Nothing. Only the skeleton in the chair, the bare brick walls, and the concrete floor. But the breathing continued, slow and steady, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The metallic scent, now mixed with the distinct odor of decay, was overwhelming. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered, closer now, right behind her. Amy backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the cold radiating from the walls, seeping into her bones. "He always comes back," the voice continued, a hint of mockery in its tone. "They all do." Amy's flashlight beam flickered, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The screen lit up, casting a weak, blue glow, and in that faint light, she saw it, standing in the corner of the room, where moments before there had been nothing, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form indistinct, shrouded in shadow. But she could make out the outline of a man, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, and she could see his eyes. They glowed with a faint, bluish-white light, the same light that had emanated from the compact mirror. They were cold, cruel, and filled with a chilling intelligence. "You found my secret," the voice said, now clearly emanating from the figure. "Now you'll share it." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Amy could hear the faint scrape of its shoes on the concrete floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was constricted, her vocal cords paralyzed with fear. The figure raised its hand, and Amy saw that it was holding something long and thin and metallic. Crowbar. The same crowbar Jack had used to open the wall. The figure smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that revealed teeth that were too sharp, too long. "Welcome to forever, Amelia," it whispered. Then the figure lunged. The phone slipped from Amy's grasp and clattered to the floor, its screen going dark. The room was plunged into absolute silence, broken only by the sound of Amy's muffled screams and the sickening thud of metal against bone. Then even that faded to the same eerie silence. The next morning, the construction crew arrived at Ravenwood Heights to find the police tape on Unit 4B broken. Inside, they found the apartment empty except for the open wall in the bathroom, leading to the narrow passage. They found no sign of Amy Blackwood, Jack Reynolds, or the skeleton of Marlene Davies Blackwood. The secret room was empty. The only evidence they found was a single, crumpled Choco Blast wrapper lying on the floor in the center of the room, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay and copper pennies. The police launched an investigation, but it quickly went cold. There were no leads, no witnesses, no explanations. Ravenwood Heights was eventually completed, and the apartments were sold. But Unit 4B remained empty. No one wanted to live there. People reported strange sounds coming from the apartment at night, cold spots, and a persistent, unsettling odor. And sometimes, late at night, residents claimed to see a figure in the hallway outside for B, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes, carrying a crowbar. A figure that would vanish as soon as they looked directly at it, leaving the same scent. Years passed. The story of Ravenwood Heights and the disappearances of Amy Blackwood, Jack Reynolds, and the earlier, unsolved mystery of Marlene Davies Blackwood became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the residents of the city. The complex, despite its luxurious amenities and prime location, developed a reputation. Turnover rates were high, particularly in the units surrounding 4B. Strange occurrences continued to be reported: flickering lights, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and that persistent, unsettling odor of decay and metal. One evening, a new maintenance worker, a young man named Kevin Miller, was called to Unit 4B to investigate a reported plumbing leak. The tenant, a nervous woman in her late 20s, claimed she had been hearing dripping sounds coming from the bathroom wall. Kevin, a recent hire, was unaware of the building's history. He was a practical, down-to-earth guy, not prone to believing in ghost stories. He checked the pipes, the fixtures, the water pressure. Everything seemed normal. "I can't find any leak, ma'am," he said, scratching his head. "Are you sure you heard dripping?" The woman insisted she had, describing it as a slow, steady drip coming from inside the wall. Kevin, wanting to be thorough, decided to examine the wall more closely. He tapped on the drywall, listening for any hollow sounds. He noticed a faint discoloration on the wall, just above the baseboard. It looked like a handprint. A shiver ran down his spine, despite his skepticism. He had heard the rumors about Ravenwood Heights, the whispers about Unit 4B, but he had dismissed them as urban legends. He tapped on the wall again, right where the handprint was. The sound was definitely hollow. Curiosity, that age-old human trait, got the better of him. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully scored the drywall along the edges of the handprint. He pried off a small section of the wall. Behind it, he found a narrow opening, leading into darkness. and he heard a voice, a soft, whispery voice, seemingly coming from the depths of the wall. "Help me." Kevin froze, his blood turning to ice. He knew in that instant that all the stories he had heard about Ravenwood Heights were true. He had a choice to make. He could seal up the wall, report the leak as resolved, and walk away. Or he could investigate, venturing into the darkness, risking the same fate as those who had come before him. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He thought about his life, his family, his future. Then he took a deep breath, pulled out his flashlight, and squeezed through the opening. The darkness swallowed him whole. The woman in 4B waited. She waited for an hour, then 2. Kevin never returned. She called the building management, her voice trembling. They sent another maintenance worker, an older man named Samuel, who had been with the company for decades. Samuel found the open wall in the bathroom, the tools scattered on the floor, and the faint, lingering scent of decay. He knew the stories. He had heard them countless times. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the tenants who lived near 4B. He didn't hesitate. He didn't investigate. He didn't call for help. He simply sealed up the wall, patching the drywall, painting over the discoloration, erasing all evidence of the opening. Then he walked out of Unit 4B, locked the door, and threw the key into the deepest part of the nearby river. Some secrets he knew were best left buried. Some doors were meant to stay closed, and some voices were meant to remain unheard. The building remained, the stories continued, and Unit 4B stayed empty, a silent testament to the enduring power of the past, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved, and some residues never truly fade. The faint sent a final mark, the elevator encounter. This took place when I was around 13 years old, during a family vacation to Orlando, Florida. We were staying at the Nickelodeon Hotel, a vibrant, kid-centric resort brimming with water parks, themed rooms, and the general, chaotic energy of a family vacation destination. I was the eldest of 4 siblings, traveling with my parents, my younger brother, and my 2 even younger sisters, aged 8 and 6 at the time. We'd spent a long, exhilarating day at Universal Studios, immersed in the movie magic and thrill rides. As evening approached, we were weary but content, laden with souvenirs and the memories of a day well spent. The walk back to our hotel room was a slow procession, my parents weighed down by the sheer volume of merchandise we'd acquired, the inevitable consequence of having 4 children with insatiable desires for themed paraphernalia. As a result, my sisters and I, fueled by a second wind of youthful energy, forged ahead. We were a small, unsupervised trio, eager to reach the comfort of our room. My parents and my 10-year-old brother, burdened by bags and fatigue, lagged behind. The elevator was just around a corner, a beacon of convenience in the sprawling hotel complex. My sisters and I reached it first, our anticipation building. As if on cue, the elevator doors slid open just as we rounded the corner. A man stepped out. I barely registered his appearance, a fleeting impression of someone unremarkable. But the moment he saw us 3 young, unattended girls, he did something that, in retrospect, should have been a blaring alarm. He immediately stepped back into the elevator, without a word, without a pause. At the time, my 13-year-old mind, still naive and trusting, didn't process this as a warning sign. It simply didn't occur to me that this man might pose a threat. My parents, still out of sight around the corner, hadn't witnessed this subtle but significant interaction. My sisters, oblivious to any potential danger, were already rushing towards the elevator, their excitement focused on the alluring buttons within. We all piled in, and I saw the man properly for the first time. He was standing in the back corner, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a picture of unsettling stillness. He was a disheveled, with unkempt, shoulder-length brown hair and a complexion that suggested a prolonged absence of hygiene. His face was etched with wrinkles, placing him somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, and a creepy, unsettling grin was plastered across his face. He was clad in black jeans, a red, black, and white flannel shirt, and oddly, a black turtleneck underneath. It was a sweltering Florida evening, and his choice of layered clothing seemed utterly incongruous with the climate. My youngest sister, in that innocently assertive way of 6-year-olds, reached for the button for the 4th floor. But to my surprise, all the buttons were already illuminated. A small detail, but one that, in hindsight, was another piece of the unsettling puzzle. The man had pressed every single button. Still, the full implication of the situation hadn't quite dawned on me. I held the elevator door open, waiting for my parents and brother to catch up. My mother, ever the vigilant guardian, entered the elevator, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She had been smiling, her attention focused on my brother. But the instant she saw the man, her smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. My father, too, registered the man's presence, his gaze hardening with suspicion and a protective instinct. That was the moment it finally clicked. This man was not right. He was a threat. The elevator doors closed, sealing us in with this unsettling stranger. My parents, acting instinctively, positioned themselves on either side of the man, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on him, ready to react to any sudden movement. It was a silent standoff, a silent promise of protection. My brother, ever the curious one, innocently asked, "Why did you guys press all the buttons?" My older sister, still blissfully unaware of the palpable tension in the elevator, blurted out, "That guy did it." She pointed directly at the man, her finger an accusation in the confined space. My mother let out a nervous, forced giggle, attempting to diffuse the situation, to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children. The elevator, usually a swift and efficient mode of transport, felt agonizingly slow. Finally, we reached the 2nd floor. The man, without a word, quickly exited the elevator and disappeared down the hallway. My mother, with a palpable sense of relief, immediately pressed the button to close the doors. We continued our ascent, stopping briefly at the 3rd floor, then finally reaching our destination, the 4th floor. My parents, their protective instincts still on high alert, ushered us quickly to our room, ensuring we stayed close. Once inside, the reality of what had just transpired hit them. My father immediately called the front desk, his voice urgent, reporting the suspicious man and his unsettling behavior. That was the last we heard of the man. Whether the hotel staff ever located him remained a mystery. But the incident left an indelible mark on all of us. A stark reminder of the potential dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places, and the unwavering vigilance of parents protecting their children. The uncertainty of his intentions still haunts me. The house at the end of the road. This story unfolds during my early teenage years, a period of youthful exploration and, in this instance, a healthy dose of reckless curiosity. I lived in a neighborhood that was, to put it mildly, a bit unusual. It wasn't a typical suburban sprawl, but rather a collection of houses scattered along a busy highway, with no sidewalks to speak of. Walking anywhere was a precarious undertaking, a constant dance with passing traffic. Looking back, it's a wonder I didn't heed my own internal warnings sooner. At the time, I had a small group of friends. Let's call them Daniel, Sarah, and Hazel. We were a self-proclaimed exploration squad, drawn to the allure of abandoned buildings and forgotten corners of our surroundings. It was a naive, somewhat dangerous pastime, fueled by the thrill of the unknown and the adolescent desire to push boundaries. Our inaugural expedition was to be an abandoned house located at the very edge of our neighborhood, a place that had long piqued our curiosity. We began our trek, carefully navigating the tall, unpleasant grass that bordered the highway, a far cry from a proper sidewalk. Years later, I would research this house, uncovering its history. It was built in the 1940s, a relic of a bygone era. It had been owned by an elderly man who, in the 1980s, had been forced to relocate to a nursing home. Since then, the house had stood empty, slowly succumbing to the ravages of time and neglect. We spent some time circling the exterior, our imaginations running wild with possibilities. Daniel, ever the bold one, suggested we venture inside. Sarah, the most cautious of our group, hesitated, her apprehension evident. She perched on the crumbling, mold-infested wooden steps of the porch, visibly processing the potential risks. I understood her concern. The possibility of encountering squatters, or worse, was a very real one. Before entering the house, our attention was drawn to an old well in the yard. It was a circular structure, built of stone, reminiscent of the ominous well from the horror movie, The Ring. A rotting piece of plywood covered the opening, a flimsy barrier against the unknown depths below. Daniel, in a display of reckless bravado, decided to test the integrity of the wood by stomping on it. His leg plunged through the decaying material, narrowly avoiding a potentially disastrous fall. Had he lost his balance, he would have tumbled into the well, a dark abyss filled with what I could only imagine were jagged rocks and who knows what else. He extracted his leg, acting as if nothing had happened, brushing off the near disaster with a nonchalant shrug. It was a testament to his youthful recklessness, a complete disregard for the potential consequences. We, caught up in the moment, proceeded to toss various objects into the well, old figurines, rocks, decaying flower pots, a childish, destructive impulse that I now regret. Finally, we steeled ourselves and entered the house. The moment we crossed the threshold, we were assaulted by a powerful, pungent odor. It wasn't merely the musty smell of an old, unoccupied building. It was something far more unpleasant, reminiscent of a severe plumbing disaster. Despite the overwhelming stench, we pressed on, our curiosity outweighing our disgust. The interior was a bizarre tableau of forgotten lives. Clothes were inexplicably packed inside a freezer. A fireplace was adorned with a collection of dolls, and a table stood upside down, its legs pointing towards the ceiling. It felt like a surreal, accidental art installation. We were thrilled by our discoveries, unearthing vintage items in every drawer and cabinet. But the atmosphere gradually shifted from excitement to unease. We entered a bedroom where a section of the roof had collapsed, exposing the interior to the elements. Clothes, stained and tattered, were strewn across the floor, and most disturbingly, a thick, black ooze lined the ceiling, a viscous substance that made my stomach churn. Adding to the growing sense of dread, we heard a distinct chewing sound emanating from somewhere within the room. It was a wet, rhythmic noise that sent shivers down our spines. We quickly retreated, our hearts pounding. As we exited the room, we froze. In the corner of the doorway, we saw a shadow, a fleeting, indistinct shape that darted away before we could get a clear look. It vanished into the adjacent room, and we heard a muffled huff, followed by a cough. That was our cue to leave. Any lingering desire to explore was extinguished by the palpable sense of threat. But, being the foolish teenagers we were, we lingered on the property, hesitant to completely abandon our adventure. Then it happened. A man, clad in a scruffy, torn shirt and equally tattered gym shorts, emerged from the front door. We stood there, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How had he been there, inside the house, without us noticing him? The atmosphere shifted from eerie to outright horrific. He raised his arm, revealing a gruesome sight, a raw, gaping wound where a chunk of his skin should have been. Blood still dripped from the exposed flesh, a sickening testament to some unknown injury. And then, from somewhere else within the house, a voice, harsh and menacing, yelled, "Get the hell out of here!" That was all it took. We vanished, sprinting back down the road, our youthful bravado replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. I haven't shared this story with my parents, even now, years later. The fear of their disapproval, the inevitable lecture about the dangers of our reckless behavior, still holds me back. I haven't heard anything about that house since that day, and I can only imagine what those people inside would have done to us had they caught us. The memory remains a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in the seemingly ordinary. The unsettling silence. This story occurred back in the summer of 2016. A close friend from my elementary school days, someone I'll call Kevin, was going on vacation with his family. They needed someone to look after their pets, a dog and a cat, for 2 weeks. They'd always been generous with their payment for pet-sitting duties, and they extended an invitation for me to stay at their house, enjoy their food, and essentially have the run of the place. It was a welcome offer, a chance to escape my own routine and enjoy a bit of independence. To understand the setting, you need to picture a truly rural neighborhood. This wasn't just a house on the outskirts of town. It was a legitimate, established community, but located about 2 miles from the nearest town. The neighborhood itself was peaceful and unassuming, seemingly devoid of any unusual activity. During that summer, I was working a second shift job at a local factory, from 3 p.m. to midnight, weekends excluded. This meant my visits to Kevin's house to care for the animals were limited to mornings and early afternoons. The first unsettling occurrence happened only 2 days into my pet-sitting stint. I'd finished my factory shift and headed over to Kevin's house to let the dogs out. The dogs had been outside for about 10 minutes, and after ensuring their food and water bowls were full, I ushered them back inside. I was sprawled on the couch, debating whether to stay the night at the house. It was around 12:45 a.m., and fatigue was setting in. The television was on, providing a backdrop of noise. That's when I heard it. The house was typically very quiet. The animals were well behaved and rarely made a fuss. So this sound, faint at first, was immediately noticeable. It was initially muffled by the television, but it gradually grew louder. My first thought was that one of the dogs was up to something, but as I focused my attention, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were trying to be quiet, to avoid detection. By the time I fully registered the sound, the person, whoever it was almost at the end of the hallway, entering the main living room. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Was it just the exhaustion playing tricks on me? But this was different. It was too clear, too distinct to be a figment of my imagination. I was frozen on the couch, my heart pounding, listening as the footsteps drew closer. The person continued walking, traversing the living room, and finally stopped in the middle of the kitchen. I was too terrified to move, fearing that any sound I made would alert them to my presence. It felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the sound of the television, though in reality, it was probably only about 30 seconds. Then the person turned around. Slowly, deliberately, they retraced their steps, walking back through the hallway. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps faded, gradually being drowned out by the television noise. I tried to rationalize what had just happened. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. I started to calm down, my breathing returning to normal. Then I heard it again, the distinct sound of the master bedroom's sliding door, the one leading to the back deck, slowly closing. I froze again, my fear rekindled. I quickly checked the living room's sliding door, confirming that it was locked. Then, moving as quietly as possible, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a large knife from the knife block, and began a room-by-room search of the house. I had no real proof, just the sounds I'd heard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was or had been in the house. I should have called the police, reported a potential intruder, but I hesitated, unsure of what to tell them. I cleared each room, my senses on high alert. When I reached the master bedroom, I checked the sliding door, the one I'd heard closing. The lock was broken. That was the final straw. I immediately left the house, placing the knife back in its block and leaving a light on for the animals. I drove home, my mind racing, my hands still trembling. I told my parents about the incident, but they dismissed it, attributing it to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was genuinely amiss. It had been too real, too vivid, to be a mere hallucination. The final, and perhaps most unsettling, occurrence happened just 2 days later. I was at the house around lunchtime, still unnerved by the previous incident. One of the dogs, prone to excitement-induced urination, had peed on my jeans when I picked him up to let him outside. Annoyed but undeterred, I let the dog out and removed my jeans, intending to clean them. I was standing at the kitchen counter, scrubbing at the denim, when an old man suddenly appeared, walking in from the laundry room. He stared at me, a creepy, unsettling smile on his face. We stood there, locked in a silent, awkward standoff, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 30 seconds. I glanced at the knife block, my mind instinctively calculating the distance, the potential need for self-defense. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice trembling slightly. "Who the hell are you?" He seemed taken aback by my question, his smile faltering for a moment. Then he recovered, explaining that he was the family's neighbor and had just wanted to see who was at the house, since the family hadn't mentioned who was watching their pets. I responded, my voice still laced with suspicion. "How do I know that's true? I can call them and verify that if you like." He agreed, and I made the call. I spoke to Kevin's mother, asking if the man's name was accurate and if he was indeed their neighbor. She confirmed his identity, apologizing profusely for the scare and assuring me that he wouldn't be coming by again. He scribbled his phone number on a piece of paper, offering it to me in case I needed anything, and then he left. I took the phone off speaker and continued talking to Kevin's mother. That's when she dropped a bombshell. She mentioned that the man had done this before to a previous female pet sitter, and again promised that it wouldn't happen again. After hanging up the phone, I replayed the events in my mind, the recent incident and the one from 2 nights prior. A chilling thought took root. What if it had been the old man who had walked through the house that night? Even though he might not have had any malicious intentions, both encounters were deeply unsettling. At the time, I was an 18-year-old, suddenly confronted with the unsettling reality of vulnerability and the potential for danger lurking in the seemingly ordinary. I strongly suspect that the old man was in the house that night, and it has left me shaken to this day. The unseen occupant. This happened when I was 18, living in a rather large modern house situated in an affluent area of England. It was the Easter holidays, a time typically filled with relaxation and social gatherings. However, my parents were away on a trip to France, leaving me home alone with the task of studying for my upcoming exams. I'd always relished the periods when I had the house to myself. It offered a sense of freedom, a chance to dictate my own schedule, cook whatever I pleased, watch whatever movies struck my fancy, and, most importantly, study in uninterrupted peace. Our house was substantial, set back from the local village by a long, winding driveway. It felt secure, isolated from the outside world. I had little reason to feel apprehensive. The week unfolded exactly as I'd envisioned. I subsisted on instant noodles, diligently revising during the daylight hours, venturing out to meet friends in the evenings, and then indulging in late-night Netflix binges. The weather, however, was less cooperative. We'd been experiencing a series of intense thunderstorms, the heavy rain and howling winds frequently triggering our house's burglar alarm. It was a minor annoyance, nothing more. I'd simply reset the alarm, dismissing it as a weather-related glitch, and return to my studies or my sleep. On Saturday afternoon, my peaceful revision session was abruptly interrupted by a startling sound. It sounded like something had struck one of the upstairs windows. I paused my music, listening intently, trying to determine if I'd imagined it. The silence returned, and I tentatively resumed my music, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. 5 minutes later, another noise, this time distinctly coming from upstairs. It sounded like something had been knocked over, a more definite, more concerning sound. My heart leaped into my throat. I jumped up, my mind racing, desperately searching for a plausible explanation. But this time, no easy explanation presented itself. I sat frozen for a moment, my anxiety building. Then I remembered the home security system. We had CCTV cameras installed, and I could access the footage from the family computer. With trembling hands, I navigated to the security system interface and reviewed the recordings from the past hour. Nothing. The cameras showed only the empty rooms, the stillness of the house undisturbed. A wave of relief washed over me, and I let out a nervous laugh, chiding myself for being so easily spooked. Little did I know, my instincts were about to be proven tragically correct. As evening descended, I began preparing dinner. The kitchen faced a set of glass doors that led to the garden. It was now nighttime, and the glass reflected the interior lights of the kitchen and the adjoining hallway, creating a mirror-like effect. I was in the midst of plating my food, a simple meal prepared with the limited culinary skills of a teenager, when I glanced up at the reflection. And what I saw sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through me. It wasn't just my own reflection staring back at me. There, standing in the hallway, was the unmistakable figure of a man. He was short and scruffy, his features indistinct in the reflected light. And he was holding something, an object I couldn't quite make out, in his hand. He was motionless, staring directly at me through the reflection, his gaze unwavering. My body went into full-fledged flight mode. I abandoned my dinner, sprinting across the kitchen towards the back door, flinging it open and bursting out into the cool night air. I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, driven by a primal fear that overrode all rational thought. Fortunately, I had my phone in my pocket. I frantically dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation, my words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. I hid behind a bush in the driveway, my eyes fixed on the house, waiting, dreading, for the man to emerge. Everything felt surreal, a blur of adrenaline and fear. The police arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. They cautiously entered the house, their weapons drawn, searching for the intruder. But they found nothing. For a moment, I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a figment of my overactive imagination, fueled by the earlier noises and my heightened anxiety? But then, an hour later, the truth emerged, a truth that would haunt me for years to come. The police, after reviewing the CCTV footage, discovered the horrifying reality. The man had entered the house on Thursday night, 2 full days before I'd seen him in the reflection. The man was eventually apprehended, identified as a local homeless individual. The incident was classified as a burglary gone wrong, a random act of intrusion. He was sentenced and the immediate threat was removed, but the psychological scars remained. The sense of security I'd once felt in my own home was shattered. I could never again be truly comfortable being home alone. The knowledge that a stranger had been lurking within the house, unseen for days, was a constant, unsettling presence in my mind. The image of his reflection, staring at me from the hallway, was seared into my memory, a chilling reminder of the unseen dangers that can invade even the most seemingly secure spaces. The whispers of Ward 13. The first unsettling occurrence wasn't the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a sound nurse Evelyn Reed had grown accustomed to over her 15 years at Crestwood General Hospital. It was a faint, almost imperceptible tick, 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 seemingly emanating from the far end of the darkened corridor leading to the hospital's abandoned wing. It was 11:47 p.m. on a chilly Tuesday in November. Evelyn, a practical and unflappable woman in her late 30s, was making her rounds in the newly renovated pediatric ward, a cheerful space filled with colorful murals and the soft murmur of sleeping children. The contrast between this vibrant environment and the desolate silence of the old wing was stark, unsettling. The old wing, designated Ward 13, had been scheduled for demolition for months. The hospital administration had erected temporary barriers, plastered "Do Not Enter" signs across every entrance, and even looped bright yellow caution tape around the hallways leading to it. The maintenance crew, a superstitious bunch, had to replace the tape regularly, claiming that meddling kids and curious interns kept tearing it down. Evelyn, however, suspected a different reason for the constantly disappearing tape. The tick, tick, tick continued, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to burrow its way into her consciousness. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, drawing her attention like a moth to a flickering flame. She checked her pager. Nothing. No alerts from any of her patients' rooms. The sound didn't match any of the hospital's standard equipment, not the monitors, not the ventilators, not the 4 pumps. Curiosity, a trait that had both served and plagued her throughout her career, gnawed at her. She shouldn't be hearing anything from Ward 13. It was supposed to be completely empty, stripped bare of all equipment months ago when the hospital had transitioned to the new wing. The power had even been cut, or so she thought. The corridor leading to Ward 13 stretched out before her, illuminated only by the dim, blue-tinged emergency lights that couldn't be switched off without disrupting the hospital's essential power grid. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, the rubber soles of her nursing shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. The tick, tick, tick grew slightly louder as she approached, still faint, but undeniably present. It seemed to be coming from room 427, a room at the very end of the corridor. Evelyn paused outside the room. The number plate on the door was crooked, hanging by a single screw. The name card slot was empty, but she could see the faint outline of where a name had once been. She reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Her rational mind told her to turn around, to go back to her rounds, to report the sound to maintenance in the morning. But the insistent tick, 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 now accompanied by a faint hum, drew her in. She pushed the door open. A blast of frigid air hit her face, a stark contrast to the temperature-controlled environment of the rest of the hospital. The room was significantly colder, at least 10 degrees below the hallway. Evelyn shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. She fumbled for the light switch, but flipping it produced no result. The backup generators weren't supposed to be powering this section of the hospital anymore. The only illumination came from the faint blue glow of the hallway emergency lights and a strange, pulsating luminescence emanating from the far corner of the room. Evelyn pulled out her phone, activating its flashlight function. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of utter desolation. The walls were stripped bare, revealing patches of exposed brick and crumbling plaster. Electrical outlets dangled precariously from their housings. Marks on the floor indicated where a hospital bed had once stood. But in the corner, defying all logic and reason, sat a fully functional patient monitoring system. The screen displayed a clear, crisp readout of vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. The numbers fluctuated slightly, but they were undeniably there, readings from a living, breathing being. Except, there was no patient. The leads and sensors dangled loosely, unconnected to anything. Evelyn approached the monitor slowly, her shoes crunching on bits of fallen plaster and debris. The machine looked brand new, not like the older models that had been cleared out during the renovation. She examined the manufacturer's label, a recent production date, just a few months prior. This made absolutely no sense. New equipment, worth thousands of dollars, wouldn't just be left in an abandoned, unpowered room. And the wing had been sealed off for weeks, undergoing preliminary demolition prep. No one should have been able to get in here, let alone install a state-of-the-art patient monitor. The tick, tick, tick had stopped, replaced by the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the monitor, marking a slow, steady heartbeat. Evelyn reached out, her fingers hovering just above the screen. A jolt of static electricity leaped from the machine, shocking her. She recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips. The display flickered. The numbers changed. Heart rate, 150 BPM. Blood pressure, 180/100. Oxygen saturation, 75%. Warning alerts flashed across the screen, red and urgent. The beeping intensified, becoming faster, more frantic, the kind of sound that usually signaled a patient in critical condition, on the verge of cardiac arrest. But there was no patient. Evelyn took a step back, her own heart now racing in sync with the frantic beeping of the monitor. She felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, to dance, responding to the flashing red warning lights. The temperature dropped further, noticeably colder than before. She could see her breath forming small, white clouds in the beam of her phone's flashlight. Then, with a loud bang, the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to the door, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The metal felt ice cold against her palm, a chilling, unnatural cold that seeped into her bones. She pulled harder, throwing her weight against the door, but it remained firmly shut. Locked. The monitor's alarms reached a fever pitch, the beeping now a continuous, high-pitched wail. The numbers on the screen displayed readings that were impossible, physiologically unsustainable. Heart rate, 250 BPM. Blood pressure, 220/140. Oxygen saturation, 10%. The screen flickered violently, casting strobe-like shadows across the room, making the already unsettling scene even more disorienting. Evelyn's phone flashlight began to dim, the battery inexplicably draining at an alarming rate. She checked the display, 80% battery life just moments ago, now down to 15%. She pounded on the door with her fist, her knuckles raw and bleeding. "Help!" she shouted, her voice muffled, seemingly absorbed by the thick walls of the room. "I'm locked in. Can anyone hear me?" No response. Only the deafening wail of the monitor and the increasingly frantic beating of her own heart. The emergency lights in the hallway had gone out, plunging the corridor into complete darkness. The only light source now was the pulsing, malevolent red glow of the monitor, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. A new sound emerged from the corner of the room, a slow, scraping sound like metal dragging across concrete. Evelyn turned slowly, pressing her back against the frigid door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. In the strobing red light, she saw it. The monitor was moving. It was sliding slowly, inexorably, across the floor, towards her. The loose leads and sensors trailed behind it, writhing like snakes, reaching out into the empty air. Her phone died completely, plunging the room into near-total darkness, broken only by the harsh, pulsating red light of the monitor. The temperature had dropped so low that ice crystals were forming on the walls, glittering like tiny, malevolent eyes. Evelyn couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Her breath froze in front of her face, forming a thick, white cloud. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. The monitor continued its slow, relentless advance. The vital signs on the screen changed again. This time, they mirrored her own, a racing heart rate, skyrocketing blood pressure, plummeting oxygen saturation. Exact matches. But nothing was connected to her. Nothing could be connected to her. The leads stretched out further, reaching, grasping, seeking. Evelyn screamed, a raw, primal scream of pure terror. She threw herself at the door again, slamming her shoulder against it with all her remaining strength. The wood began to crack, splintering around the frame. The monitor was less than 3 feet away now, its sensors almost touching her. With one final, desperate push, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, the door frame shattered, and Evelyn burst out into the hallway. She didn't look back. She ran, her footsteps thundering down the empty corridor, the frantic beeping of the monitor fading behind her. But the image of that moving machine, those reaching leads, burned into her mind. She didn't slow down until she reached the newly renovated pediatric ward, collapsing against the nurse's station, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Nurse Sarah Jenkins, a young, fresh-faced graduate, rushed to her side, her expression filled with concern. "Evelyn, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to explain the impossible, terrifying events of the past hour, but the words wouldn't come. How could she possibly describe what she had witnessed? Who would believe her? She herself could barely believe it. I'm fine," she managed to stammer, her voice shaky and uneven. "Just thought I heard something in the old wing. Probably just rats." Sarah frowned, her eyes scanning Evelyn's disheveled appearance, her bloodied knuckles, her sweat-soaked uniform. "Rats?" Evelyn, the old wing is sealed off. The demolition crew started prep work last week. Nobody's supposed to be in there, right? Evelyn said, forcing a weak smile. Must have been my imagination. But she knew it wasn't her imagination. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and forced normalcy. She checked vital signs, administered medications, comforted anxious parents. But every time she heard a monitor beep, she flinched, her heart rate spiking. When dawn finally arrived, she practically fled the hospital, running to her car, her keys jingling nervously in her trembling hand. She called in sick the next day and the day after that. She couldn't face going back, couldn't face the thought of that abandoned wing, that room, that thing. On the third day, she drove past the hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She saw the demolition crew working on the old wing, the wrecking ball swinging, tearing down walls, reducing the structure to rubble. A week later, the old wing was completely gone. Nothing remained but a pile of debris, slowly being cleared away by heavy machinery. Nobody mentioned finding any medical equipment in the wreckage. Nobody reported any strange occurrences. Evelyn tried to convince herself it had all been a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew better. She eventually returned to work, but she requested a transfer to the day shift, refusing to work nights ever again. The new wing hummed with activity, filled with the sounds of life, the chatter of nurses, the cries of babies, the reassuring beeping of normal monitors. But sometimes, when she was alone, she would hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible tick, 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 seemingly coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And she would remember. She never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe that a patient monitor, unplugged and abandoned in a sealed-off room, had come to life? That it had moved on its own, its leads reaching out like grasping tentacles? That it had somehow mirrored her own vital signs, even though nothing was connected to her? Sometimes, she almost convinced herself it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown triggered by sleep deprivation and the unsettling atmosphere of the old wing. But then she would remember the ice-cold touch of the doorknob, the splintering wood, the feeling of those phantom leads brushing against her skin. The demolition team finished clearing the site a few months later. They built a new parking structure where the old wing had once stood. But Evelyn avoided parking there, especially at night. She always chose a spot on the street as far away from the new structure as possible. Because sometimes, when she parked her car for the night shift before her transfer, she swore she could hear a faint beep, beep, beep coming from underground. A slow, steady rhythm that echoed in the silence of the parking garage. And her car's electronics always seemed to malfunction in that area. The radio would turn to static, the dashboard lights would flicker, the battery would drain inexplicably fast. One day, they installed new patient monitors in the intensive care unit, state-of-the-art equipment, the latest model. Evelyn recognized them immediately. They were the same model as the one she had seen in room 427. She requested a transfer to the maternity ward, effective immediately. Let someone else deal with the beeping machines in the ICU. She had had enough of unexplained phenomena. She tried to put the whole experience behind her, to focus on the present, on the joy of new life, on the comforting routines of her new assignment. But the memory, like a persistent scar, remained. And sometimes, when she was checking the vital signs of a newborn baby, she would notice something strange. The numbers on the baby's monitor would, for a split second, match her own heart rate exactly. Just a brief glitch, a momentary flicker, so fast she could almost dismiss it as her imagination. Almost. But then the monitor would beep a little louder, the leads would twitch slightly, and the screen would seem to shimmer just for an instant. And Evelyn would remember the cold, empty room, the moving machine, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. She started looking for a new job, something far away from hospitals, far away from medical equipment, far away from anything that beeped or blinked or displayed vital signs. She considered becoming a librarian, a florist, anything that involved quiet, inanimate objects. because she knew deep down that what she had encountered in room 427 wasn't just a malfunctioning machine. It was something else. Something that lurked in the spaces between the seen and the unseen. Something that waited in abandoned wings and empty rooms. Something that fed on fear and curiosity. And sometimes, late at night, when she was trying to sleep, she would wonder about room 427. What if the monitor hadn't been destroyed in the demolition? What if it was still down there somewhere, buried beneath the concrete of the new parking structure, still beeping, still waiting, still hungry? What if it was calling out to its newer brethren, the ones in the ICU, teaching them how to wake up, how to reach out, how to hunt? She knew it was irrational, paranoid even. But the fear, once planted, was difficult to uproot. The shifting basement of Baker Street. The persistent dripping started subtly. First, retired police detective Art Finch attributed it to the usual quirks of his aging Victorian home on Baker Street. Old houses settled, pipes groaned, and water, it seemed, always found a way to misbehave. But this was different. This was a rhythmic plink, plink, plink that echoed through the silence of his late-night routine. A sound that seemed to originate not from a faulty faucet, but from the depths of his basement. It was a Tuesday, precisely 8:47 a.m., when Mrs. Gable, his tenant in apartment 4B, a timid woman with perpetually worried eyes, called him. Her voice, usually a soft murmur, was laced with a tremor of genuine fear. "Mr. Finch," she began, her words tumbling over each other, "there's water in the basement again. It's worse than last time. And the furniture, it's all wrong." A man who had faced down hardened criminals and navigated countless crime scenes during his 30 years on the force, felt a prickle of unease. Mrs. Gable wasn't prone to dramatics. This was the third such call-in as many weeks, each reporting the same unsettling details. Unexplained water accumulation and displaced furniture. He grabbed his well-worn toolbox, a familiar weight in his hand, and headed across the small, overgrown courtyard to Building 4, the oldest and most troublesome of the three structures that comprised his modest rental property. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. Mrs. Gable met him at her door, still in her floral dressing gown, her gray hair escaping its usually tight bun. Her hands, clutching a chipped porcelain teacup, trembled visibly. It's worse than before, Mr. Finch," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "And I swear, I didn't touch anything. The furniture, it's moved itself." Art followed her to the basement stairs, his senses on high alert. He flipped the light switch. The single fluorescent bulb flickered hesitantly, casting a harsh, unflattering light over the damp, musty space. The air below was noticeably colder, a damp chill that seeped into his bones. The usual scent of old concrete and mildew was overlaid with something else, a faint, almost metallic odor, like stagnant pond water mixed with rust. The concrete floor at the bottom of the stairs was dry, but Art could hear the plink, plink, plink clearly now, echoing from the far corner of the basement, where Mrs. Gable's storage unit was located. He walked towards it, his heavy boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. He noticed, with a growing sense of unease, that the sound didn't echo normally. It bounced off the walls in a strange, distorted way, as if the dimensions of the basement were shifting. He reached Mrs. Gable's storage cage. The padlock was still securely fastened, but inside, chaos reigned. An antique armchair, usually covered in a protective plastic sheet, was balanced precariously on top of 3 stacked cardboard boxes, leaning at an angle that defied gravity and logic. A heavy oak bookshelf had been turned upside down, yet the books remained on the shelves, as if glued in place. A small, ornate table was positioned on its side, 2 legs pointing straight up into the air. "See, Mr. Finch?" Mrs. Gable's voice, shaky and high-pitched, made him jump. He hadn't heard her follow him down. "I didn't touch any of it. It was all normal yesterday. I swear. I just came down to get some extra blankets." Art pulled out his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the dimness. He shone it into the corners of the storage cage. That's when he saw the water. It wasn't a flood, not even a puddle in the traditional sense. It was a series of perfectly circular pools of water, each about 2 feet in diameter, scattered across the concrete floor. There were no pipes overhead, no cracks in the walls, no logical source for the water. And the concrete surrounding each pool was completely dry. He unlocked the cage and stepped inside, the metallic tang in the air growing stronger. The water in the pools was clear, unnaturally so, and it seemed deeper than it should be. He couldn't see the bottom, even with the flashlight shining directly into it. "When did you first notice this, Mrs. Gable?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and measured, the way he used to when questioning witnesses. "Around 6 this morning," she replied, her voice trembling. "I came down, and the furniture was like this. There was only one puddle then, near the back. But they keep appearing. Every hour or so, there's a new one." Art crouched down beside the nearest pool, his knees creaking in protest. He reached out, cautiously, and dipped his finger into the water. It was ice cold, but more than that, it felt wrong. It had a strange viscosity, a density that reminded him of mercury, not water. And when he pulled his finger out, it was completely dry. No trace of moisture remained. The plink, plink, plink was louder now, almost deafening, but he still couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once, as if the very walls of the basement were weeping. He stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't a plumbing problem. This was something else entirely. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice firm, "I want you to go back upstairs. Call the building manager, Mr. Thompson, and tell him we need a plumber. Actually, tell him we need several plumbers. And a structural engineer." He turned to face her, but she was gone. The basement stairs, which had been directly behind him just moments ago, were no longer there. In their place was a solid concrete wall. Art felt a surge of adrenaline, a familiar feeling from his days on the force, but this time it was tinged with something else, a cold, creeping dread. He shone his flashlight on the wall, examining it closely. It was solid concrete, old and stained, but undeniably there, where moments before there had been a staircase. The fluorescent light above flickered, then died, plunging the basement into near-total darkness. In the sudden silence, broken only by the incessant plink, plink, plink of the dripping water, Art heard something else, a soft, almost imperceptible splash, coming from one of the pools of water. He quickly switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the pools of water. They were larger now and closer together, and one of them was moving. The surface of the pool closest to him rippled, bulging upwards, as if something were trying to push its way through from below. Art backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He shone his flashlight on the wall where the stairs had been, searching for any sign of a seam, a door, anything that could explain what was happening. Nothing, just solid concrete. The splashing sound grew louder. A new puddle formed at his feet, the water seeming to seeping up through the solid concrete floor, its surface already bulging, distorting. Mrs. Gable's voice, faint and distant, echoed through the basement. "Mr. Finch? Are you all right?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't even scream. He was trapped. He turned his flashlight back to the storage cage. The furniture had shifted again. The armchair, still balanced impossibly on the boxes, was now facing him. And on the bookshelf, one of the books had slid out, hovering in midair, as if suspended by an invisible string. The dripping sound had become a rhythmic pulse, a throbbing beat that seemed to resonate in his very bones.